All right. Lactoid invited onto stage. Oh, there he is.
Hello. Hello, everyone.
Yo, yo.
Am I audible? How do I sound?
Terrible, but audible.
Damn.
I actually sound terrible? For real?
You sounded sick,
Oh,
but you sound better now.
I sound better now? Okay, good.
Mm-hmm. We'll wait like 2 minutes. People pile in.
Oh boy.
By the way, did you do a announcement in your server?
Who are you talking to?
Both of you.
I did.
Nice.
And on my Twitter.
Nice. All right, give me 20 seconds and then we'll get started here. All right, let me pull the bot in. Okay. All right. Welcome back. We've got some returning competitors back to square off again. And today we've got the topic on net homeschooling in the US is bad. We've got Econoboi on the pro and Lactoid on the con. And they already know the format, so we'll dive right into it. 4-minute opening statements. Econoboi, how about you lead us off?
Yeah, sure. Why not? Let me get my little stopwatch out. And you ready? I will start at any time.
Yep, go for it.
Alrighty. Yeah. So I think that this debate was spawned because I was in Desi's Discord at one point, and we were talking about homeschooling for some reason. And pretty much most people in the chat, including myself, were pretty skeptical on the idea of homeschooling in general. Like, it just seems pretty bad for kids a lot of times because of socialization. Academic achievement, when looking at the data, seems like it has very mixed results, and it seems like the best data seems to indicate net bad results oftentimes on homeschooling. And that's obviously not a good thing as well if you consider that, maybe the main goals of schooling are to uh, instill essentially academic merit and achievement into students, and then also to hopefully prepare them for social situations and working with others. There's a reason group work and teamwork and stuff like that are such a big part of education. It's because, kids need to learn that kind of stuff. And there's a big, I think, reasonably open question on whether or not homeschooling prepares students in those realms. I think another reason why I would say that generally homeschooling is bad is because at least it's bad in America, right? Like the way it's currently regulated. I can't really speak to other countries. Didn't have time to research other countries in preparation for this, but a lot of states in the United States are so underregulated in terms of homeschooling. It's honestly kind of fucking unbelievable. So, and I'll just rattle off some stuff. So, number one, the overwhelming majority of states, like 80% of states or something like that, have no requirements to become a homeschool teacher. None. You can just teach your kids with, no college degree, no subject specific expertise, no teaching expertise, no education degree. Just any random ass fucking parent off the street can just completely take over their child's education without any training or knowledge at all, right? And that's probably pretty bad, especially when we get to upper level subjects, not elementary subjects and things like this. And that's actually revealed in the data, right? Which is that oftentimes homeschoolers struggle in more sort of cognitively difficult subjects, let's say, like math and physics and things like this. And, the natural conjecture of most researchers is that, well, that's probably because these parents simply just are not qualified to teach those subjects, right? Most homeschool parents can't teach calculus 2 properly because they just don't know anything about it. And that's obviously very reasonable, whereas most people have a much stronger grasp on reading and writing and teaching descriptive things like history. And, that's pretty natural. So the call for more regulation is probably pretty reasonable in that regard. Some other things that are actually pretty completely insane as well, if you ask me, is that the overwhelming majority of states have no accountability or testing requirements for homeschooling students. Some states don't even have subject requirements, which is pretty insane. Like the idea that you can just teach your kid whatever you want in homeschool, and also there's no actual ability to test their knowledge on those subjects. That seems completely insane, at least on a mandatory basis to me as well. And one thing that is also pretty crazy, if you ask me, is that some states have the combination of all of those things. That some states, there's no requirements in terms of who can teach their kids homeschooling and what training requirements there are. There's no requirements on what they have to teach their children, which seems pretty insane in and of itself. And then number 3, there's no requirement on any assessment of how to grade if their students are even knowledgeable in the subjects they're learning. And so the idea that there's states that have any of those 3, much less all 3 of those 3, just I think breaks the bounds of intuition for most people. And certainly it seems like the literature backs that up if you really look into the higher quality literature available. And so I hope we can get into it. Maybe I'm open to be proven wrong. This isn't my area of expertise, but let's do it. Should be an interesting conversation. That's all I got.
Cool. All right, good.
Yeah, so some of you in the audience may be wondering as to why this debate is framed in the negative, why Econoboi has the task of affirmatively proving that something is bad, as opposed to myself having to prove that it is good. And the first reason is that after several hours of research, I've discovered that there is actually very little data on homeschooling. Most of the limited information stems from only a few sources, primarily the 2011 and 2014 Cardiff Education Survey, the National Home Education Research Institute, a recent Harvard survey conducted by Chen, Hinton, and Vanderweel, and about 14 lesser-known peer-reviewed studies analyzed by Professor Brian D. Ray in a literature review that I will be referencing. All of these studies and surveys can be critiqued about their methodology, sample sizes, sample selection findings, and what normative claims can be extrapolated from said findings, even the newer ones. However, the primary academic opponents of homeschooling are forced to admit that there is little to no data showing that homeschooling is bad, and most arguments rely on individual anecdotes. Of all the information we do have, most of the peer-reviewed studies indicate overall positive outcomes for homeschool children, even when controlling for background factors. Now, the second reason why Econoboi has to prove that homeschooling is bad is in order to determine something is bad for any kind of practical purpose, such as banning or regulating homeschool, the burden of proof is on somebody who wants to do a affirmative action. The burden of proof is on you if you want to ban or regulate something. This is especially true when it involves the state, an inherently coercive entity, intruding on one of the most important and sacred relationships that exists, which is that between parents and their children. Furthermore, we cannot say that homeschooling is bad. We certainly can't say that we should ban it. And in fact, the evidence we have thus far, however limited, indicates that homeschooling is good.
All right, cool. Let's get into back and forth.
Yeah, so
sure. I guess, go on, Lactoid.
Well, the first question is, when you're referencing, I've been looking for a lot of this shit. When you're referencing the more recent literature is indicating negative outcomes of homeschooling, which specific literature are you referring to?
Yeah, sure. So I think there was a really good literature review done, and let me, I can just post it in the chat. There was a really good literature review done by seemingly competent researchers, and I believe they update this periodically. The latest one that I could find was in 2020. I'll paste it in the main stage chat. And essentially what they do is they just try to systematically go through all of the research that's available on homeschooling. I think you're correct to point out that a lot of the data is dog shit on homeschooling. And one of the most dog shit people on homeschooling is the Ray researcher that you cited. I mean, Ray is somebody who is a homeschooling lobbyist. And when you look at a lot of the most comprehensive surveys that he does, he actually sends out those surveys in groups of Christian homeschooling parents, right? And he says, this is used to promote homeschooling. And so naturally, there's like a pretty incredible sampling bias with essentially anything Ray promotes. And that's why most of the more systemic reviews of Ray's research have shown that, you probably cannot really rely on his evidence. But the systemic review that I provided goes through all of these issues, and they talk about the best available research that they find. And they tend to find mixed results in their literature review. Some of the caveats, and the last thing that I'll say is that some of the caveats that they point out, I think, are pretty reasonable, which is not that homeschooling is like a completely awful way to educate kids in all circumstances. And I'm not sure anybody could really tenably hold that position. However, one thing that they have found consistently in the literature is that homeschooling is greatly dependent on parental quality and the motivations for parents bringing their kids into homeschooling, right? And so the overwhelming majority of well, not the overwhelming majority, but like about half of parents that bring their kids into homeschooling say that, we want to bring our kids into homeschooling for religious instruction, for things like this. A lot of these parents are not qualified to teach the subjects that they are oftentimes not required, but sometimes required to teach. And that's why a lot of the long-term studies that look at, well, really the only long-term study that looks at sort of the outcomes of homeschooling kids finds that they're greatly underprepared in many areas of collegiate education and also just in life in terms of outcomes where oftentimes they make less money when they end up becoming full-fledged adults. They oftentimes also don't go to as prestigious of colleges, and they oftentimes don't stay in college for as long a period of time as non-homeschool kids. And generally, the outcomes are, significantly more mixed. And then when you combine that, and this will actually be my last sentence, when you combine that with the fact that contextually it does matter why students are getting homeschooling, but then you look at all the incredible lax regulation in so many states, and that's something I'd be interested to hear your opinion on, is like, does it like make intuitive sense? And maybe it does to you for philosophical reasons, but like to me, it doesn't make any sense. The idea that a parent can have no qualification to teach their kids whatever they want in homeschooling, and have basically no accountability for the quality of that education. That just seems pretty bad to me. And so the idea that we need more regulation in homeschooling just seems, I mean, fucking like a complete home run, if you ask me.
So obviously, I don't have the time to read through this 84-page analysis right now. I did skim through it, and what I'm finding, I mean, just on page, on like several of the early pages, 19, 18, I mean, it seems like their analysis of the test scores is, again, mixed. It's indicating that even among the studies that indicate the worst outcomes, it does indicate that homeschool kids perform better on some testing, such as reading and language comprehension, but then slightly worse on math.
That's what I said earlier.
Right, but you're referring to you're referring to a paper that's analyzing one of the 14 identified peer-reviewed studies on this, where 11 of them are saying that homeschool kids have an advantage across the board. I don't disagree that there are three.
Well, I think you're misusing that phrase peer review, right? Because ultimately it's not that difficult to end up in any one publication. That's one of the things that this literature review points out, right? Is that a lot of the peer-reviewed studies, a lot of the literature that's published on homeschooling is basically just survey data. It's just like, oh, homeschool kids on average score better on this than other, like the national average of students. But obviously, that's not how any actual causal research is determined. You have to control for factors, right? Like, and so of course you might be able to find some peer-reviewed literature that says this, but that's part of the ultimate conclusion of this, which I would say is kind of an open-ended conclusion, but it at the very least raises a lot of concerns. The idea that, well, we basically don't know for sure that homeschool kids do better than regular, like, sort of public school kids, but the best data available to us points to pretty mixed outcomes, right? And it points to a contextual understanding that's pretty important.
So again, the literature review that I posted, you can actually go through and there is not all of them are by Ray, right? I think one of them is by Ray. That obviously he's going to identify as one that's having positive outcomes, because although I'll grant to you that he definitely seems to have a political slant on this, That doesn't necessarily mean that his research is bunk, or that also doesn't necessarily mean that the studies that he identified done by other people are bunk. Again, 11 out of 14 of them, the ones that we know exist, support positive academic outcomes for homeschool children. 2 are mixed and 1 is negative.
Well, respond to what I said, though, because you're just repeating yourself.
Well, you made it like 4 points. I'm going through them one by one, right? So I guess I'm just emphasizing that obviously this is going to be a little bit of a study war, right? You have your study or literature review that you're going to point to saying, hey, all the other studies that are shit except for obviously the ones that support my position. And then I'm going to
That's not what I said.
Hold on. I'm going to point to a literature review that indicates that, well, the totality of the peer-reviewed information, I don't know how necessarily you're drawing that all the ones that indicate positive outcomes are bad and the ones that indicate mixed outcomes are good. I will agree there are several. There are several. I don't think that you actually have like gone through each and every study to know as to like the methodological flaws of all 11 studies.
I didn't, but these researchers did, and that's what they found.
And yes, and there's researchers that back up what I'm saying too. Right, specifically the researchers that not only conducted those studies, but also the PhD that did a literature review on them. I understand that you want to back up the academics that support your side, but again, this is like
you're
more.
Not responding to what I'm saying, though.
What are you saying?
Okay, so you're saying I've got a lot of peer-reviewed research that agrees with what I'm saying, and I'm saying, hey, I'm directly responding to that. I'm saying I recognize you have a quantity of information available to you. However, when we look at the quality of that information, it's very low. And you're citing a pro homeschool privatization lobbyist as your aggregator of that information. That's the link that you just posted, right? And so what I'm saying is that if you look into the studies that he aggregates, because he's a lobbyist, he's biased, he's not a neutral academic, you'll find that essentially the methodology of many of these studies, and I would say the overwhelming majority of these studies, is essentially just survey data without proper controls. There's no experimental design. There's no long-term follow-up. And that's what you continuously are. You're just saying, well, I've got a quantity of studies available that agrees with me. Okay, well, let's talk about the quality of that
So
education.
you're not listening to me though, right? Because what I'm saying is that the basis that you're going off of in saying that these studies are low quality is the opinion of the literature review of Robert Kunzman and Milton Gaither that you just linked, right? You're relying on them to tell you that these studies are essentially surveys that don't control for background data. When you go and look at those surveys and studies, you can find out that actually they do control for a significant amount of background data. Now, each study, obviously, like I started out in my intro, for every single study, you can find make critiques about the methodology, sample sizes, sample selection, etc. This is true with every single study on homeschooling ever, even the quote-unquote high-quality ones that Robert Kunzman and Milton Gaither are pointing to, right? Those ones also have issues. But what I'm saying is that, like, we can get into a battle of the studies here, but what basis, other than the opinion of Robert Kunzman and Milton Gaither, what basis do you have to say that the studies in favor of homeschooling are low quality?
So I've already explained that, right? Is that when you look at a lot of the research compiled by Ray, which again, that is what appears to be what
you said you haven't looked at it, though.
You keep on referencing.
You said you haven't read those studies,
No.
though.
So, okay, first of all, I doubt you've read any of the 11 or 14 studies you're referencing. Okay,
no, it's absolutely not true. I linked the literature review that has them all linked in there.
Methodologies then.
For each one, there's a in the literature.
You've read all of them, apparently.
I haven't gone through each single one. Okay, but what I'm telling you is that
now the truth comes out.
No. In the literature review, on each there's a table underneath like the specific studies that are linked that indicate specifically what factors they're controlling for, and they do control for factors such as some of them control for parental income. It indicates if they don't control for parental income if it doesn't control for other factors. But there are controls, and for you just claiming that they all don't have any controls, I mean, what basis do you have for that?
Okay, so that's never what I've said, right? What I've said is the overwhelming majority of these types of studies are of a low quality, right? And they're basically just survey results compared to national averages. That's not a very reasonable methodology, right? And that's one of the things that my source actually goes through. I'm sure a lot of the studies that you're referencing I'm sure a lot of the studies you're referencing are internalized in the research. Like this is a comprehensive, like nearly 100-page review of basically all the data. I mean, the research that I talked to looked over about 100 studies across multiple different states and contexts and regulatory, governance, let's say, to try and attest to the evidentiary quality of the outcomes of homeschooling, right? And they mention Ray throughout because Ray is oftentimes cited by a lot of pro homeschooling people. In fact, one of the one of the funny findings that they find is that the only long-term study on the outcomes of homeschooling was actually done by a pro privatization, pro homeschooling group. And the data that they found, even within their own survey and their own long term follow up longitudinal data, was so bad that not only do they have to constantly say why, in fact, these studies, oh, well, the data says this because of this reason, it's not a big deal. But, the fact that basically in every possible metric, homeschooling kids end up worse off, like they have to explain that away because the only good long-term data that exists is the study by the pro-privatization homeschooling, organization, right? And Christopher Ray is just another one of those people, and so
Wait,
that's
which
what
one are
I'm
you
saying.
referring
That's
to?
why I say
Are you
that.
referring to the Cardis Education Survey for that one?
Yeah, I believe so. The one where
Okay.
it's what is it? 2054 young adults that they survey over a period of time.
So the Cardis Education Survey, it's been done in 2011 and 2014. There were absolutely positive results found by that, and in fact, the person who did that survey later criticized the academics using that data and posted an article explaining how the data was being misinterpreted and why it was being misused. This is
No, I
actually
agree that they have had to do that because the data looks
sure,
so
sure.
bad.
So I understand you're saying, well, it doesn't actually look that bad. The only negative aspect is that people continue to refer to, which I think is interesting, right? Is the overall lower attendance of college, right? There is a drop, about 23% less likely for homeschool kids to go to college than public school kids, right? Which is a relatively significant drop. That was the primary negative finding of this study. That being said, right, the people that did go to college scored higher on a number of tests, right? Even the link that you provided me just now, page 19, a study referenced, I guess one of the more anti-homeschooling studies referenced by these guys here, indicated that homeschool kids do score above average in reading and vocabulary and slightly
I
below
agree.
average in math computation. And so let's just
That's
go right. So let's just go ahead then.
So
Right?
I'm not afraid. Just to be clear, I'm not
Sure,
afraid to
sure. I
recognize that there's
understand.
a lot of nuance in the
Well, yeah,
outcomes
there
of homeschool
is.
kids,
There
right?
is. There is a lot of nuance, but this is the critical. This is the critical part, right? Because if what you're saying, and let's just roll with it for a second, because I'll be charitable.
All right.
If you're saying that the studies that most of the studies here are complete garbage, except the ones that you're referring to are a little bit better, a little bit less garbage than the ones that I guess have a more strong pro homeschooling data outcomes, right? The ones that are more mixed, that kind of
Bias.
demonstrate like a more mixed, like actually homeschoolers are better in this way than they are in the other way. I mean, do you believe that this is sufficient to claim that homeschooling is bad?
Yeah, I would say that. Yeah, I would say that if you compare the incredible mixed outcomes on socialization and educational outcomes, the lack of data, and then also mix that with what we know is at least like the I think the one truth that we can relatively definitively point to within the data when you look at outcomes and things like this for homeschooling students is that it is greatly dependent on parental context. Like, why are you homeschooling your kids? Who are you in terms of your ability to homeschool kids, your qualifications and what you're teaching them, things like this. And when you compare that with the incredibly lax regulation, that's a question you still have an answer, and that's fine. We can go point by point. But like the question that I am immensely interested in answering is given that that's true, or in fact, even let's just say given that's uncertain, whether you think that that's true or not, isn't it just simply intuitively ridiculous? The idea that in so many states, there are no qualifications to be a homeschooling teacher. There are no requirements in terms of what you actually teach your kids. And there are no abilities to hold those parents accountable in terms of the quality of their teaching, in terms of testing their students and things like this, just ensuring they get an actual quality education. I mean, whether you think homeschooling is great or terrible, it just seems like you'd probably want better regulations on homeschooling to ensure that, basically kids are learning within a reasonable band, like what they should be learning and in a quality way.
Sure. I mean, you could very well make the argument that, and this is why I wanted the thesis here to be so clear, right? Because I don't think there's sufficient for sure evidence to demonstrate that homeschooling is bad. I think, again, most of it is either mixed and or good. But is the question, could we make it better, right? Could we control for like specific scenarios that we can imagine that would seem to be, morally reprehensible? I suppose we could. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean homeschooling is bad. That just simply means we can make it better. But at the
It kind
same
of does, though,
time,
right?
well, no, because so for example, right, if you have like a system that's, let's just say it's working, like there's no indication that it's like working poorly, like what would be the justification for regulation on this other than, I guess, just some kind of, intuition of, well, obviously we have to have our hands in this, right? Like, shouldn't regulation and laws depend on some kind of empirical information that, hey, we need to
Well, no,
step in?
it's it's not an intuition, right? So when I say intuition, what I mean is that I would say for most people, in terms of people's lived experiences and what they know about, I mean, most people aren't education scholars, neither are we, right? But like I would say that most people, when they hear that a lot of homeschooling contexts are just completely unregulated and unaccountable, they would say that's probably not good. Like we should probably do better in terms of how we regulate and hold these types of things accountable to the regulatory state and things like this. But ignoring that, right? The first part that I think is very definitive in the literature is that when you talk about outcomes of homeschooling teachers, or well, I say homeschooling teachers, like the parents that are teaching their children, basically for the most part. I don't know if there's a lot of homeschooling where it's not the parents teaching, but in terms of homeschooling outcomes, right? The biggest definitive silver lining in the data is that it's just greatly dependent on the parents' education, the parents' training, and the parents' curriculum structure. And what they find in the data in this literature review that I posted was that when parents are oftentimes coming to homeschooling with their own education, with a structured curriculum that is similar in terms of there's a word for it, I can't remember, but essentially a similar teaching structure to public schooling in the sense that you're going to learn several subjects each day and you're going to have written assignments, and they're doing essentially public schooling at home, that those outcomes typically are very positive for students that they're teaching. Whereas when you're talking about parents who basically pull their kids out of school because they think there's drugs in schools and they think that the morality of schools is bad and schools have gone woke and we just don't trust public school teachers to not groom our kids, those parents often do completely terrible at teaching their children, which shouldn't be a huge fucking surprise for anybody that's listened to an interview of these types of parents talking about their beliefs, that they're actually not too great at teaching their kids what they need to learn to be sort of productive and successful and happy adults, right? And so given that that's the case, and that's the regulatory state that so many states send towards children, that yeah, like we probably have a net bad system for homeschooling because so many kids who are homeschooled are being homeschooled by people with no qualifications and, of course, at the time, because they're kids, have no ability to test whether or not they're actually learning what they're supposed to be learning, right? And that seems bad to me.
Yeah, but I guess where do you get the basis to call it a net bad if at most what you've said is that results are mixed?
Because if we work under the operation out, to be fair, when I say the results are mixed, I'm saying the results are clear in some ways, right? It seems like the results are clear in some ways in the sense that when we talk about the positive outcomes for homeschooling, right? Oftentimes, when these studies control for the involvement in parental education, that's a big determining factor in educational outcomes, whether it's public school or homeschooling. That was one of the interesting findings in the literature that I posted, was that if you control for parental involvement in education, the outcomes don't really change that much. And that kind of implies that a lot of the data that Christopher Wray cites, and this is what you find because he basically just cites naively survey results a lot of times, is that, well, a homeschooler might have on net better educational outcomes, not necessarily because of the function of homeschooling, because that's really what we're testing here, but because homeschool parents are oftentimes necessarily more involved in their child's education. But if you send your kids to public school and you as a parent are very involved in your kid's education, then they're probably going to have similarly good outcomes. It's more of a thing about parenting than like the mode of education, which I think is an
Yeah.
important
So
distinction.
this could be true, right? And this is one of the issues again with the data. Again, I just want to emphasize, in order to call it bad, I believe there needs to be some kind of, beyond some sort of intuitive, well, we're just not regulating it, some sort of empirical information indicating that it actually is bad, right? So you talked about how parents, they're afraid of drugs. Well, I think in especially today's environment, drugs are something to be afraid of as a parent, especially in terms of the opioid crisis and fentanyl overdoses and all that bad stuff. And homeschool kids, very statistically significantly, are much less likely to get involved in drugs and much less likely to get addicted to drugs, right? That is a benefit of homeschooling that, again, is empirical. Now, we can point, again, I don't disagree with you that you can find some studies indicating some mixed results in terms of academic achievement. Even though, maybe I know you're just discounting the ones that Ray is curating here. But even though it does appear that most studies on this question indicate an overall beneficial academic performance. Otherwise, it's relatively mixed with benefits in some areas and perhaps detractions in other areas.
Well, do you see why I say what I'm saying with regards to the mode of education?
So I understand that, and this could absolutely be true. But again, even if it is the case that parents are, the children who have more successful outcomes in homeschooling, the reason why they have more successful outcomes is because the type of parent who's going to be involved in a successful homeschooling experience are going to be more involved parents. That's fine. That's actually not necessarily a detraction on homeschooling, because homeschooling allows good involved parents to have more of a say over their kids' education. At most, what it appears that I think the most you could probably get to is maybe we should have some regulation in place that the parents who are fucking up really bad, that they have to be better. That those specific, in order to bring up the overall average of homeschooling, even beyond public school, we need to make it sure that the shit homeschool situations, that we have some kind of regulation that controls for them. Would I be opposed to that? Not necessarily, right? I'd be open to looking at what kind of regulations that would be if, if it's going to be targeting a group that we have some kind of empirical information to believe is going to raise overall student outcomes. But again, overall, homeschooling is not bad, right? In America, the experience with homeschooling in America is not bad, and there's little to no evidence indicating that it is a overall bad experience. At most, you can say it's mixed. And there are social benefits that come with homeschooling as well. You brought up at the very beginning, social, lack of social inclusion, social awkwardness. But even that information is particularly mixed. Not only do you have lower drug use overall, there's studies that indicate lower depression. There are studies that indicate lower rates of sexual abuse. Now, you may say, well, kids who are homeschooled may be more vulnerable to sexual abuse from their parents because they're more isolated. That 100% could be true. But then also public school kids could be more vulnerable to sexual abuse at the hands of their colleagues, at the hands of other high school children that are there in school. That could be also making up for the difference. Again, the information indicates that public school students are more likely to experience sexual abuse. Now, you can just say, well, that's because of lack of reporting. Yeah, that's going to be a really difficult part here in terms of obtaining that information.
Well, we're not necessarily making parenting decisions here, or necessarily advocating for what should parents do with their kids right now. For me personally, I would hope to have kids at some point pretty soon with my wife and stuff. I would literally never support homeschooling unless it was a serious sort of local need for homeschooling. My kid has a serious disability and just has no ability to interact with other children. There's certainly sort of physical and social requirements that could be the case that you just have to homeschool your kids, right? But then some parents would think the exact opposite. I've met parents who will say, I would never want to send my kids to public school because all those fucking crazy public school kids are drug addicts and they're having sex and they're talking about fucking crazy shit all the time, and I don't want my kid exposed to it.
They're more likely to be drug addicts.
Well, I don't agree with that. I don't think the average public school kid is a drug addict, but
not the average. They're more likely to get addicted to drugs than a homeschool kid.
Okay, sure. In the sense that maybe 1% of homeschooling students are exposed to drug use, and 3% of public school. That was the research that I saw. It was the difference is a 300% increase in the probability, but obviously in absolute terms, your kid's not very likely to get exposed to drugs or be a drug addict or something if they go to public school. And so it's important we look at those absolute figures there. But nonetheless, right, forget about drug addicts or anything like that, right? My only point is that when we're talking about overall bad or is a system bad, right? I don't think that calling a system bad is necessarily the same thing as saying it's overall bad, right? And I'll explain my logic using the U.S. economy as an example. So I think that one of the biggest criticisms of the U.S. economy, at least for me, is not that the U.S. has terrible quality services or economic institutions. Oftentimes, the best education systems, depending on who you are American educational institutions. Oftentimes, the best healthcare outcomes that you can get are in America, right? Oftentimes, the best wages and job opportunities you can get are in America, right? And overall, when you look at the aggregate statistics, like America has the strongest economy in the world, right? However, I think that when people say, "Oh, the economy in the U.S. is bad," oftentimes they're saying the inequalities associated with the U.S. economy are so bad that it means that we're doing something, we're missing something so important and key in the American economy in terms of how we take care of people on the lower end of the spectrum. And so, similarly with homeschooling, what I see in the data is a huge inequality in outcome and a huge inequality in the determinants of positive outcomes. And typically, those determinants are parental education, parental involvement in education, and the motivations for why parents choose homeschooling, right? And so, when we see a system that might have some net positive benefits. Now, to be fair, you can't point to any net positive benefits because you're saying, oh, the literature is mixed. I'm not so sure we can basically point to the system being good or bad. It's like, okay, well, fair enough. But it seems like the literature points to, at the very least, a huge inequality where a lot of homeschooled children, and when I say a lot, I mean like basically 50% of them, like it seems like a huge percentage of parents have oftentimes bad motivations for why they're taking their kids into homeschooling. They're often underqualified to teach their kids those subjects, and they have no accountability for the quality of that education in terms of standardized testing and things like this. And the long-term data that we have, you mentioned the CARTA study, oh, it only has one bad outcome. That's not true, right? The long-term outcomes that they find in the CARTA study show that formerly homeschooled students report lower SAT scores than privately schooled people. They attend less selective colleges for less time. And also what I mentioned was that they tend to have lower pay when they graduate, right? And those are three pretty bad outcomes insofar as we think that making good money, being highly educated, things like that are probably good things, right? Like that's something that the CARTA study points to. And when we disaggregate that and we compartmentalize it into why that could be the case, typically in the literature, you always find, well, the answer is about the parents and why they homeschool their kids and how they're doing it and their qualifications to do so. And so that's why I would say the homeschooling system we have is bad because it allows so many unqualified people to put their kids in a less than optimal environment for education relative to public school and certainly relative to the best examples of public school that we have available to us.
Okay, so I wrote down some points just so I won't cut you off. So when you're saying it's bad, it doesn't mean it's overall bad. I actually disagree. The debate subject here is whether or not it's a net bad, right? Net aggregating the overall positives compared to the overall negatives.
That's not the subject.
It's not?
It just says bad.
I want to get I assure you it is net bad. I don't.
It's not.
Duke.
It's in the chat you said, I was told you would be defending is homeschooling bad, not net bad, not overall bad, anything like that. Like that's what I read. But
the wording we have is on net homeschooling in the US is bad. But I mean, Econoboi could still have the same interpretation of what bad means and then say on net if it's that.
Well, my point is just to say that whether or not you're talking about net bad, overall bad, whatever it might be, is that our system in general does not engender the types of positive outcomes that we would expect from homeschooling, right? And that's like the main point that I'm trying to push into the debate. Like, is the system good when we allow so many children to basically slip through the cracks? I would say no. Like, it's probably not net good. At least there's a huge opportunity cost to the system that we have today.
All right. So I guess I would just assert that the information's unclear on it, whether or not it's a net good or net bad. I don't think there's sufficient evidence to demonstrate that it's a net bad. When I said that the information was mixed, this was me being charitable, pointing to only the peer-reviewed studies that you are referring to, the ones that are more critical of homeschooling, the ones that demonstrate more negative educational outcomes. When again, there's a lot of other ones that you're just writing off that aren't necessarily done by Ray, that demonstrate an overall positive academic outcome for those children. My position is not actually that, well, all the information just shows that it's a total wash. I think right now the plurality of the information appears to indicate benefits, but the actual studies in of itself are bad in the sense of I wish there was better information out there so we could actually use this information or better information, have a better idea as to what the overall outcomes are of homeschooling, about whether or not it's bad on net, and especially whether or not it's sufficiently bad to regulate what I think is one of the most, again, close relationships that exist within our society, which is that between a parent and a child. I think that the overall threshold in order to get involved there and actually to like insert the state into telling parents how to raise their own children is higher than otherwise it would be if we're talking about, I don't know, a business and their employees, right? We're talking about like a much,
Well, can I
a much
ask a
closer,
question?
a much closer. I wrote down points, so I just want to go through them, right?
Oh, okay, sure.
And I'm almost done. This is most of my point. So I think the overall threshold is got to be sufficiently high. When you're talking, when you pointed out the survey, again, the person who ran that survey actually is in favor of homeschooling, and later came out and criticized a lot of the ways this is being stated. The less pay thing is it did show that there, and by the way, I've not been able to find any evidence as to what percentage of lower pay it is, but the survey itself indicates that the lower pay is statistically insignificant, which is interesting why that would be the case if you have a lower college admission overall, which you do, right, about 23%. And so I think the ultimate question, and I think I would like to have more data on this, is what actually is happening there with the overall lower college admission? Is it homeschoolers who would otherwise like not go into a shit degree and not waste their time going to more profitable fields or maybe more fields suited to them, as opposed to qualified homeschoolers who are just not going into a field that they otherwise would excel in? That in particular, I really want to find evidence on. And I would like to see evidence as well on overall pay between homeschoolers and non-homeschoolers, which I also haven't been able to find, right? The data on here is I think, significantly lacking. And yes, again, the college thing I think is the big thing that I noticed that would appear to indicate some kind of problem. But I also, going back to there being a number of like positives, right? Like that same, there was a Harvard survey recently that found that exact same stat. And it also, the exact same survey indicated that homeschool children are more forgiving. They're more charitable. They're more likely to volunteer. Overall, they're more likely to get better SAT scores, and they're more likely to graduate. They're less likely to be involved in drugs and alcohol, et cetera, et cetera. We can talk about pro-social outcomes here. If all you're saying is, look, I don't know if it's on net good or bad. I just want like some common sense regulation that like, if we go, like once every 5 years or whatever, if we go in and this kid can't even fucking read, then maybe we should like, hey, parent, you got to fucking do something to make sure this kid can fucking read. If that's like the level we're talking about here, just to like basically raise the floor and make homeschooling better, I'm not opposed to that. But that's not enough to say that homeschooling overall on net is bad.
Sure. So I guess to respond to that again, I don't want to say that we're splitting hairs in terms of describing what it means to be net bad or bad overall, because I really don't think that I am. I guess I'll leave it up to the audience to see which like way of thinking makes the most sense, right? Because again, in my view, if we find that, okay, well, this system, if implemented, and not this, just this system, like any system in general, this system, if implemented, leads to like net good outcomes in terms of, I don't know, like per capita GDP goes up by 1% or something like that, right? Let's just say that that's the thing that we're measuring, right? And then we find that, okay, well, if we do this policy, per capita GDP goes up by 1%, but it leads to like the bottom 10% becoming 50% poorer and the top 1% becoming 50% more wealthy. And then on average, we get a 1% difference in outcome. I guess some people might say, well, overall, that's a good policy, right? Because on average, and you could even say on median, we end up with like better, sort of consumptive ability pre and post that policy. But I feel like most people would say, well, if a 1% difference in median outcome is in exchange for the bottom becoming so much poorer, that's probably a bad policy, right? And I think that when people decide whether or not it's a good or a bad policy, they try to think about, well, essentially, what's the policy that I would vote for? And if I would vote for that policy, I'm thinking in my head it's net good. And so even though they would be voting against a policy that on median might have a 1% difference, 1% positive impact, they're saying it's net bad because it makes poor people so much poorer. The inequality associated with that policy is probably a bad thing. And so that's why you say over and over again, there has to be like a high degree of evidence. There has to be a high standard of evidence if we're going to try and bring in the coercive power of the state to regulate something, because we just simply don't have that. But I've repeated over and over again that what we do have, it seems like when you control for these different parental factors, right? The motivations for the parents, the background of the parents, and of course the accountability of the parents in terms of, whether or not they can get, people get tested and things like this to see the outcomes of their kids at the time of actually receiving the education. It seems like what we find is that all of those things are a huge difference in the outcome. So it seems like when you find good educational outcomes, I'm sort of slipping this in without explicitly saying it, when you find these like net beneficial outcomes, what you're internalizing within that is this huge inequality where the parents who have good educational backgrounds, who have oftentimes good structural motivations for putting their kids into homeschooling, and who oftentimes are tested and evaluated for their ability to teach their children, they are bringing up those averages to a great extent compared to the parents who basically don't have all of those things, or only two of the three, or only one of the three, or none of those three things, right? And so we know that parental background matters a ton, and we almost across the board don't regulate those three things, right? That overwhelmingly so, those three things are typically not regulated, right? At least based on what I was able to find, maps and stuff like that with how homeschooling is regulated. And so if that is the case, that even if what you're saying is true, that, there's some net positive outcomes if we look at aggregates and we compare them to averages, well, that's not enough for me to say that we have a good system, because we have such an opportunity cost of where we have so many poor outcomes internalized in that net increase. And we have these good outcomes that aren't associated with any corresponding regulation or any learning lessons from them, right? And so if the only lesson we have from the data is parental background and parental motivation matters a ton, right? But we don't actually regulate that at all in almost every state, or we don't regulate any of the three of those things, or only one or two of those three things, then we probably have a pretty bad system for homeschooling, right? And we need more regulation. And that's really what I'm advocating for as well. And I think the literature review that I put it at best, and I'll just read this paragraph off. And they talk about how these bad outcomes, they say, formerly homeschooled young adults reported lower SAT scores than privately schooled subjects, attended less selective colleges for less time, ended up working in jobs for lower pay than graduate of other forms of schooling. And what they say, which is a pretty sassy paragraph for a bunch of researchers, they say the Cardis organization is a pro-private school, pro-homeschool organization, so its staff have tried very hard to spin these findings in a positive way, but the clear and unavoidable conclusion of what is probably the most rigorous data set ever created to measure homeschooling's long-term academic impact is that homeschoolers as a whole do not have great educational and economic success if measured by conventional standards like a college degree and a high-paying job, right? And so that's kind of why I think our system is bad. We definitely need more regulation. The coercive power of the state has found yet another realm that they can pry themselves into, if you ask me.
Okay, so you totally fair that you read a quote. I'm going to read a quote as well. This is from my literature review. The majority of peer-reviewed studies on academic achievement reveal a positive effect for the homeschooled students compared to institutional schooled students, while a few studies show mixed or negative results. Regarding social and emotional development, a large majority of studies show clearly positive outcomes for the homeschooled compared to those in conventional schools. Majority of studies on the relative success of the home educated who later became adults show positive outcomes for the homeschooled compared to those who had been in conventional schools. Those are the findings here of this literature review, which I also, again, posted. As to the overall claim here, when you're talking about how, even if on net it's good or at least impossible to say that it's bad, right? That the system, a system of inequality, even if we measure all the negatives and all the positives, even if that comes out to slightly net positive, this still wouldn't overall be a good system if the negatives for the bottom half are sufficiently low enough that this would be, I guess, beyond the threshold of what you would declare to be a bad system, right? So to be fair, the difficult part about this position is it is somewhat unfalsifiable given the information that we have, which is that as long as there's any kind of inequality in the lowest end of public school kids compared to homeschool kids, you could, even if it's one person, right? You could just simply argue, well, a system that would allow one student to fall through the cracks so low is worse than a system, even if it does generate an overall net positive outcome. if we're going with this line of logic, it is unfalsifiable. Like under the proposition, under the, I guess, the suppositions that you're running with, I would have to just accept that in your opinion, yeah, I suppose it would overall be bad. But I guess I just personally disagree with that. If a small number of people fall through the cracks, but the overall net impact is positive, I would still say that the overall system is net positive. But I'm also curious, if you don't know this, I am curious. When you're saying that the overall bottom of the barrel, I suppose, of educational outcomes from homeschooled kids, where are you getting that, and are you sure about that? Just because, I guess anecdotally speaking, yes, I can fully imagine, or I guess intuitively can fully imagine a kid who's totally abused and is like completely neglected, etc. But then I can also imagine like a public school kid who, gets into fentanyl hell and gets involved in gangs, or, gets their fellow high school students pregnant. Right? I can imagine like terrible scenarios like that, especially in high crime areas, or specifically high crime areas. So I guess, how do you know that the overall bottom of the barrel for homeschoolers is actually worse than overall bottom of the barrel for public education students?
I think it's about the comparisons in terms of how different regulatory states kind of shake out in terms of outcomes for public school students. So, America, essentially, like every aspect of American regulation, it seems like every public institution in America has particularly bad problems with inequality. So you're right to point out that public school education is highly unequal as well, right? You're talking about going to like a poor school district in Detroit versus going to, a public school in the Hamptons or something like that. You're going to have really huge differences in outcomes, right? But when we compare and we look at the best educational systems in the world in terms of low rates of inequality of the type that we're describing, and we look at, how they tend to regulate things like this, it seems like public school can be regulated in such a way that we collapse those inequalities, and we collapse those inequalities in outcomes as well, where everyone can kind of be lifted up. And the same thing goes for homeschooling as well. And that's why it's not really, for me, like I haven't really made a lot of arguments in terms of we need to prevent people from doing homeschooling because public school is so much better. I've already said that my preference for my future kids ideally would be for them to go to public school. But I have my own personal reasons for that, obviously. And you don't have to have a study to back every one of your parenting decisions, obviously. But in terms of how we regulate things, I think there's a lot of room for homeschooling to be regulated to be better, just as I would say the same thing for public school, right? And I'll read off, a couple quotes from this literature review that I mentioned, and it just kind of backs up what I say generally, and this is where I'm getting this from. They talk about math assessments being a lot worse for homeschooling students, or at least like noticeably worse, let's say. And one of the conjectures that the authors provide is that parental educational background, the fact that most people just aren't very good at math, and so having your parents teach, kids algebra 2 and stuff, things that they aren't very good at, would probably lead to a lot of gaps in their education in terms of mathematics and stuff like that. One thing that they find is that, and this is a quote from the study, one of the obvious reasons for the potential finding that homeschooling heightens performance at the extremes of the distribution curve is that it, by definition, magnifies the role of the parent in a child's education. A consistent finding in the literature on academic achievement is that parental background matters a lot. Belfield, 2005, found greater variance in SAT scores by family background among homeschoolers than among institutionally schooled students, which is to say that the inequality of outcome for homeschooling is worse than the inequality of outcome for public school students. Bolter's 1999 longitudinal sample of 110 students whose parents averaged only found a consistent pattern of gradual decline in achievement scores for the longer a child remained homeschooled, a result she attributed to the relatively low levels of parent education in her sample. Medellin's 1994 study of 36 homeschoolers found a significant relationship between mother's educational level and child's achievement scores. The last thing that I'll say is, quote, this methodology permitted the authors to make comparative claims, finding in their case that homeschoolers whose families use a more structured pedagogy, that was the word I was looking for earlier, outperformed their demographic equivalents in public school, but those using a more unstructured or unschooling approach underperform, right? And so when the literature to me finds that this inequality is worse in homeschooling, it's pervasive in homeschooling insofar as there's many, many states that simply don't regulate these kinds of things that we know drive outcome in homeschooling, I would say, yeah, at that point you have a compelling case, if I was a legislator, to say Well, we probably need to regulate those things. We probably need to say, hey, if you're going to homeschool your kid, you probably need some training. You probably need an education degree. You might need a subject specific degree. You might need to have a compelling reason for why homeschooling is appropriate in your case. And that could be a broad set of reasons, not like only the most narrow reasons that I listed earlier. And your kids need to be tested, right? Your kids need to have subjects that they have to learn, and they need to take standardized tests like every other kid because we care about educational outcomes for students, not just students in the public school system.
Okay, a couple questions. I guess couple statements and then a couple questions. So, I'm
Yep.
I'm immediately skeptical of when you're talking about structure. I saw this a couple times too in some of the literature that I was reading. That yes, kids who have a more structured homeschooling environment perform better than those who have a more unstructured homeschooling environment, which I think makes intuitive sense, and so it's not surprising that the data would also bear out that way. But the problem is you're comparing it's interesting how they were comparing. Okay, when you have a structured system, it performs better than public education students, but then when you have an unstructured system, it performs worse. That's not necessarily a statement about relative inequality because you're comparing two sects of homeschool children to the combined sect of public education students, right? So again, going back to whether or not it's on net. Even if we weren't looking on net, I would want there to be some kind of equivalent breakdown between in public school about whether or not there's some kind of unstructured or structured. Maybe we can compare it like parents being involved compared to parents being uninvolved. I think that would be more interesting data. The other question I have for you is a question I have for you is let's say it was. Let's just say I'll agree. I don't, but let's just say I'll agree that homeschool is not as regulated as it should be. If it was to turn out that the bottom 1% of public school kids, even regardless of the regulation that is in place in public education, the bottom 1%, because of, they get involved in gangs and drugs and they drop out and everything, let's just say the empirics demonstrated that they actually underperformed compared to the bottom 1% of homeschool kids. Would you then say that public education is bad in relation to homeschooling?
So I'm a little confused by the question. I'm not trying to avoid it. So you're saying if we looked at the worst 1 percentile outcomes of homeschooling and said, even when you control for everything, it's better than the worst 1 percentile outcomes for public school kids, would I at that point say, well, if you live in like a terrible, terrible school district, even if you're unqualified, all this stuff, would it be preferable to homeschool your kids?
Well, so specifically, like we don't have any regulation, right? So there's no regulation on this, but the empirics just come out to be that the bottom 1% of homeschoolers do better than the bottom 1% of public school students because of all like the gangs and drugs or whatever, let's just say.
Yeah, the context. I mean, I would say that I'm very outcomes based, right? I'm very outcome oriented. And so if somebody could prevent convincing findings that, hey, if you're that parent, in the Detroit school district and it seems like evidentially speaking, homeschooling is just like strictly a better outcome, even if you're unprepared, even if you don't have a degree to teach, that, should you take your kid out of that public school and homeschool them? I would say yes, right? That would be the right thing to do at that point. But it's, that's not what the evidence says. Like, I would do that. I have 2 master's degree and my wife's on her way to getting educated as well. If I lived in the worst school district in Detroit, I'd be very comfortable pulling my kids out of public school and homeschooling them, because that is like what the evidence kind of, points to, is that if you are prepared, if you have that education, if you can, come up to standard on your pedagogy, then you can have pretty good outcomes for your kids in homeschooling. Like, I would probably do that. Honestly, the first thing I'd probably do is move to a better school district if I was in that circumstance, if I could. But assuming you couldn't, then yeah, my choice would be to homeschool.
If the kids, let's say we have a program in place where the homeschool kids get tested, and the kids that are tested are doing in line with what we'd expect for that area for, basic like math, reading, language comprehension. Why would do you think the parents should need a degree if the kids' outcomes are the same or better than their public school equivalents?
Well, yeah, again, so I'm outcome oriented, right? So like if we found that even if the parent had, and this is not what we find in the literature, but if we did find it to be the case that uneducated parents with no teaching experience and unstructured curricula could somehow have better outcomes than basically public school kids, I would say, well, at that point, I mean, fuck yeah, I guess homeschool your kids while we figure out how to fix our public school system. But that's not what we find in the literature, and that's why I'm skeptical of
Well,
homeschooling
that's
in general.
not that may not be, and I don't disagree that there's probably a correlation between having an advanced degree and being able to be a better educator. I think that's probably makes sense. But what I'm saying is that testing here is, if you're outcomes oriented, testing ideally should be the only thing that you would need, right? Because it's testing the outcome. So if you had, the only
Well, I've already
regulation.
agreed.
Yeah. So if we had like a regulation, for example, the only regulation is like homeschool kids can't fall below like XYZ percentage when it comes to XYZ topic, and then like this is the new rule. And then like you have a kid who's like, let's say neither parent graduated high school, but this kid's just fucking killing it on like math and reading and et cetera because his parents really care, and like they're like reading to the kid, they're like sitting down and helping the kid through everything. Like in this scenario, you wouldn't be like, oh, you guys don't have a fucking degree, so you guys can't do this, right? As long as the kid's doing well, you would be like, all right, I'm not going to get involved. Let the parents educate the kid.
Well, yeah, no, I would no, not necessarily, right? Because like you might not be a utilitarian, obviously, but I would call myself a utilitarian. Like I would just say that in general, it's about what would generically speaking be the best rule for society, right? And so the literature to me points to the idea that probably a good set of rules for how we uh, regulate homeschooling and the access to homeschooling, things like that, is probably that your parent needs to have some kind of training. And I'm open to whether or not that's a proper 4-year degree in education or maybe just a 12-week, training course or something like that. But like some type of training makes sense, some type of certificate. Standardized tests, or at the very least, some sort of obligate testing that the students have to do in order to compare these outcomes. And if these outcomes are sufficiently poor, then at that point, maybe you send in an auditor. Maybe you say, hey, you need to send your kid to public school or extra schooling or something like that. And then also having actual sort of state curricula and say, like, you have to teach your kid certain things. You have to teach your kid Algebra 2. You have to teach your kid American history. You have to teach your kid biology, and not like religious biology, like actual evolutionary biology, right? And so stuff like that, I think, are generally positive regulations. So to answer your question specifically, if you could point to an example where, oh, well, the parents are relatively uneducated and untrained, but because this kid is just like so smart and like such a go-getter, and like for one reason or another, they happen to perform so well in homeschooling, it's like, well, yeah, but in general, what's the best rule? Like, probably it would be the case that that kid would be better off in a public school environment, generally speaking, right? And so you probably, to some degree, you can make policies on the margin, but in general, it's probably better for that kid to be in a public school environment. I mean, unless there's some compelling reason that the kid just couldn't perform in public school the way that they could perform in homeschool, then I don't know. I would have a hard time making policy around that.
I hear what you're saying. I guess my only contention is that if we're talking about outcome oriented, which to some extent I am outcome oriented, we're talking about stuff as outcome oriented. It just doesn't make sense to me that if we're getting good results, like which we're measuring through testing, if we're getting good results in a specific situation, and a kid's doing better than the average, it would appear to me that requiring the parents to have a degree doesn't actually seem to be outcome oriented, because I can imagine a scenario, for example, where like if the testing shows a kid is doing like good or better than like their public school equivalents, it might be intuitive to say, well, the kid could be doing better in a public school with higher educated teachers. Or it could be intuitive that, like, actually, if the kid was in public school, they might develop behavioral problems, which might disrupt their education. Which public school students tend to have more behavioral problems compared to homeschool kids, right? Or they might get caught up in drugs, or they might get caught up in sexual assault. They might be caught up in all sorts of things. So if we're talking about like an outcome oriented system, I don't disagree that, like, does it seem weird to me that you could have a functionally illiterate 15-year-old who, like, the state just doesn't care at all the fact that they can't read at all and the parents aren't even bothering to teach them reading? Sure, I agree, right? But if the kid is meeting all the testing requirements and they're better than their public school equivalents, I don't necessarily care if the parents have a degree or not, or what sufficient credentials the parents have. Because look, right. I have a doctorate. I'm gonna let you know, like, these fucking degrees, I mean, they're pieces of paper. Yeah, they demonstrate that we went through something, but there's plenty of people without degrees who are also like incredibly intelligent, who are perhaps even better educators than people with degrees. And as long as the kid's doing well, it just seems kind of like ivory tower elitist to say,
Right.
well, even though you're doing well, like fuck you, you don't have the piece of paper. So
Well, I'm not talking about, again, I'm not necessarily talking about getting a 4-year degree, right? Like if you were to be able to convince me, and we have 50 states, like we can run 50 different experiments and just like choose the one that works out the best. Um, if you were to be able to present like, hey, sending parents through a 16-week part-time training course that they can do out on the nights on the weekends or something is like sufficient training to close 80% of that gap in outcome, like, okay, yeah, fuck, like maybe not, like maybe don't require them to have a 4-year degree. Because you're right, like I don't really care about whether or not you have a doctorate degree or a master's or a bachelor's or an associate. It's just about like what's the best rule in general. And we have all sorts of things like this in society. Like I think society is generally governed by sort of rule utilitarianism. Maybe that's like a function of democracy in general. I think it probably is. But like take a driver's license as an example, right? Like there's probably a lot of people who can drive a car perfectly fine. I grew up in a small town where most people just drove illegally and didn't give a fuck. And there's many people like that who just drove illegally perfectly fine, never got a ticket, never got in an accident. But like, is it still a good thing to have driver's licenses? Like, probably yes, right?
well,
It's probably still a good
I
thing.
think driver's licenses are actually a great example because I think driver's licenses, you're granted them upon successfully completing a test. And if we're talking about adults, and I think this should be the case for all people, including minors, you don't have to necessarily take driver's ed, at least in my state, right? So like you don't have to take a
Well,
course
sure, but
and
exactly,
get the driver's
no, no.
degree. If you can pass the test, if you can demonstrate knowledge, then you should be able to drive.
Well, no, but Lactoid, exactly your point, right? Is that if a teacher could pass a test and say like, oh well, I have whatever sufficient background without training to be qualified to teach my kid, and I can pass a test that speaks to those qualifications, that's perfectly reasonable, right? And so I wouldn't necessarily have a problem with that. But the question that I was going to ask with you is that let's say that for instance, let's say that you had a police system in a city. Let's say that you have the police system of St. Louis, right? So a pretty high crime city, let's say. And the police system decided, you know what, guys, if we just violated everyone's constitutional rights, like wiretap them without warrants, knocked their doors down, just started arresting people with any sort of vaguely gang affiliated tattoo, it turns out crime goes down a lot, right? If we do that. Now, I would say, and I genuinely have a struggle with this. Like when we look at what's happening in El Salvador, that's basically what's happening in El Salvador, where all constitutional like civil liberties are being completely violated by this president, but the outcomes kind of speak for themselves, right? And so I kind of err on the side of, well, it's not that there couldn't be a circumstance where that is appropriate to do. However, I'm generally speaking as my red-blooded American self of the idea of basically just completely eschewing away institutional sort of checks and balances and constitutional rights. But if the outcomes speak for themselves, it's kind of hard to argue against, especially because the guy has a 90% approval rating in El Salvador. People like what he's doing. So how would you fall on that question? Like if it were the case that we could essentially violate some basic liberties and rules of a system in order to achieve great outcomes, but potentially at the long-term health and institutional legitimacy of that system, would that be a good thing to do? Like I tend to say no, but maybe the answer is yes. What would you say?
I tend to say no too, but not in all circumstances. And I think this kind of goes back to the threshold I was talking about because I think the state in of itself is an inherently coercive organization. And anytime it gets involved in you, like with your life, it is to some extent violating your rights, right? And so then the question becomes like, okay, when does the state get to violate people's rights? Well, if there's a sufficient interest here that we have for the state to do this. Now, having cops in general, like police in an area, I do think that, like, yes, if an area has a whole shit ton of crime, then the police are more justified in policing that area. We should have more police in that area as opposed to lower crime areas. That just makes more sense, right? But when it comes down to like violating basic constitutional rights, well, this is going to depend on the gravity of the situation, right? If you have like a civil war scenario where the South seceded, and you have like a whole bunch of fucking people raiding armories and arming themselves and shooting American soldiers, then the obviously the response here is going to be different, right? Because well, are you violating constitutional rights by shooting back at them? Well, are you like there's caveats here for constitutional rights when it comes to like very pressing government interests or very pressing interest in other individual rights where they also have a right to not necessarily be affected by this. So is there a scenario in which I would direct police to like quote unquote violate constitutional rights? I would be very hesitant to do so. The threshold would be incredibly high. But if it like was sufficiently bad enough where like, okay, we have to like pass something here that like suspends, we have like more stop and frisk, or we suspend some kind of like norm that cops don't normally do because we have to do something. I can be amenable to that. But again, the threshold for me is super high. And that's why the homeschooling thing, right? Like,
maybe it's just a difference in how bad we think these problems are. 'Cause
Right,
I would say they're
right.
pretty bad.
Well, right, but
maybe
for
you're just
homeschool,
like, no.
yeah, for homeschooling, again, like the worst evidence I've seen is that it's mixed. So I'm not seeing like anything here that's sufficiently bad enough for homeschooling to like on net to like implement some kind of like grand like system in which now we're regulating, or potentially some people are, I'm not saying you're doing this, but some people are advocating for banning homeschooling, right? Like these are pretty extreme.
Sure.
These are pretty extreme actions that I don't think there's sufficient. There's no sufficient evidence indicating that it's bad enough to do that. Could it be possible? Yeah, it could be possible. Like if for some reason it just turned out that every single homeschooled kid was like a fucking idiot and couldn't read and couldn't write and couldn't do math, and like for some reason like this is consistently the case, and like turned out to be terrible people, higher crime rates, etc. Then yeah, at some point it's like, well, fuck. Obviously, this is like a terrible problem. We have to step in. But with the very mixed information, especially not even information to declare that it's a net bad, no, we don't have enough here to like say that it's bad, and we certainly don't have enough to ban it. And we like maybe have enough for like some minor common sense regulations. I could get on board with testing, like a test requirement every 5 years or 4 years or whatever, just to make sure kids are actually like keeping up with like some base level requirements on reading, math, et cetera, et cetera. But other than that, like I don't see any other like action that's justified by the data.
Well, I don't think that. And yeah, and again, maybe it's the nature of our regulations and like what we would recommend and how intrusive we think it is. Because I don't think anything that I would recommend would be particularly intrusive to homeschooling. Like, I would say that and it's pretty much a state regulated thing. It seems like the federal government doesn't like seem to generally get involved with curricula decisions or qualification decisions of states. Like, we don't really see that proposed. I think the closest thing was Common Core, but that was a voluntary program that came with a lot of money, so that that wasn't like a strict requirement that you had to do either. And so I would say that the regulations that I would require, or like that I would advocate for on a state level, as living in Texas or something, I would say, hey, to the extent that we don't have these things, and I have to look over at Texas specifically, but like I would say I would agree. We definitely, like, whatever standardized testing students in public schools have to take, you guys got to take them too. I would say whatever that amount of training turns out to need to be, whether it's a qualification test, whether it's training in a qualification test, whether it's just training, whether it's a 4-year degree, you need to do that as well if you're a parent and you want to homeschool. 3, I would say that there needs to be actual structured curricula requirements for homeschooling. Like, for me personally, no, you can't just teach your kid that evolution is fake and creationism is real and there's no instructional requirements, and you have to teach your kids math and you have to teach your kids like literature analysis and things like this. That there should be some kind of curricula requirements, like whether it's expansive or very, very small. And I don't think that's particularly intrusive. I think it's less intrusive to the point that, like, if a parent told me, well, what the fuck, Econoboi? It's bullshit. You're telling me I can't teach my kids creationism and I have to teach them physics and math. And it's like, yeah, dickhead, we think that's a basic thing kids should learn in like every fucking public school and private school in the state. So yeah, just because you teach your kids in the confines of your own home doesn't mean that you have just like homeschooling shouldn't be considered like, oh, this is where you can just do whatever you want with your kids' education. Like, no, education's a public good. Education's something that we feel like has a social purpose and value. And I'm not talking about grooming kids or teaching them secular morality or anything like that, but, giving a kid a basic set of subjects and knowledge that they have. I think that's why we regulate public school in that way. We should just do the same exact thing with public school. Obviously, when it comes to abuse, like, you talk about drug abuse and sexual assault, like, one of the fucking most completely insane things that was in this literature review that I thought was just, the numbers were fucking unbelievable, honestly, which was a study, and I'll just quote from the study. Medical professionals in one study in Oxford 2014 gathered cases of severe child abuse that had been documented by their respective medical institutions in Virginia, Texas, Wisconsin, Utah, and Washington State. They found that 29% of the school-age children had not been allowed to attend school. 47% were removed from school under the auspices of homeschooling, and an additional 2 children were removed with basically no parental education. And so what that tells me is that if you implemented these regulations, not only would like the regulatory state of homeschooling eliminate those negative downsides of homeschooling, but they would also probably eliminate a significant amount of that abuse related to homeschooling. Now, I would never make the claim that just because you're homeschooling your kids, that means you're abusing your kids. Like, that's a crazy thing to say. But if we imagined you had to meet these minimum regulations before you could just pull your kid out of school and start teaching them whatever you want under the auspices of homeschooling, well, that probably would happen to a much lower extent, because just because you're abusing your kid, that's not a great reason to pull them out of school. It's like, hey, do you have this like degree, training requirement? Hey, are you prepared to actually teach them the subjects they have to do? Are you giving them the standardized tests that you're supposed to be doing? And all those things probably leads to less child abuse as well. And to the extent that child abuse is a problem in public schools, well, obviously it seems like there's ways to regulate that in a way to, ensure the safety of children, prevent school shootings, prevent, sexual assault, drug use in schools, things like that. And I would just advocate for those things in public school as well. And so if we can agree on the testing, if we can agree on the parental requirements and on the curriculum requirements, at least in principle, then it turns out we actually completely agree in totality.
And I don't think we can agree on some of that stuff, but maybe we can. So a couple things. I'm glad you. I'm very. It's good that you added the caveat when we were talking, because I did see that in those numbers as well about abuse, and it doesn't surprise me, I suppose, that some parents who are abusive, and that's to be the case in which CPS would get involved, right? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean the kids are going to be, because CPS is likely not going to get involved in abuse that happens to a student by other students at a high school, right? That's going to be different agencies and different organizations. So it doesn't surprise me that CPS getting involved in terms of parental abuse is going to have, like, the abusive parents are going to be more incentivized to isolate the child, and thus are going to be more likely to pull their kid out of school. That doesn't surprise me. But you're right in that you can't use that to extrapolate that homeschool parents or homeschool kids are generally abused, and you can't even extrapolate that homeschool children are abused more or less often, right? Because again, there's different kinds of abuse that can happen in high schools that CPS is just not going to get involved in. In terms of regulating, in terms of regulating child abuse, we can try to regulate and we can try to enforce laws, but there's certain, like, just simply being in an environment, even with sufficient regulations, can make people more prone to certain levels of abuse. So, for example, I have a somewhat hot take that I think that underage sex generally is sexual abuse, like regardless if it's consensual or not, because minors can't consent. And so if this is the case, right, like there's a lot of, I think, unreported or like not statistically recorded sexual abuse that's happening in high schools. And there's very limited ways we can do to regulate that, other than the fact that, like, hey, they're around a bunch of other children, and they have an opportunity to do this, even if we put regulations on top of that. This could apply for even things that you and I agree with should be regulated for children, including drugs and other forms of sexual abuse that we would agree are abuse. But yet, public school kids, even though drugs are banned from public schools, public school kids are more likely to get involved in drugs and alcohol because it's simply more accessible, because there's other kids there that are more likely to have behavioral problems, peer pressure, et cetera, et cetera. I agree with minimal testing requirements. I don't agree with the curricular requirements or education requirements for teachers, again, because what it seems like you're doing here is that you're concerned with the overall outcome of the children, which ultimately we both are. But if the outcomes for the children are being measured by the testing to begin with, then if we're outcome oriented, to me, it doesn't actually even matter. Like, as long as the kids can do what we expect them to do, it doesn't matter how they got there, right? So if, again, you have a kid who's consistently well off, like in all the testing metrics, then it doesn't matter like what curricula they have or what the education requirements of their parents are, if they're doing what we need them to do. And then, so because the ones that aren't doing what we need them to do, well, they're failing the tests. And if they're failing the tests, then we can come in and then we can say, okay, parents, you need to take some kind of like course on how to teach math because your kid thinks 2 + 2 = 5, right? Like at that point, if they're failing the tests, then I could see some kind of remedial action on top of that. But,
but if we had a systemic reason to believe that parental characteristics led to a higher propensity to fail those tests, and thus kind of a more deleterious transition away from homeschooling because you're failing the test so often, wouldn't it be compelling to say at that point, well, maybe we need to have a some sort of training requirement because we have all these homeschool kids failing this test. It's highly correlated and seemingly causal with parental education. So we probably need to require parental education because what we have is like, thousands of students potentially failing these tests because their parents aren't equipped. And so that's our signal. We see that signal in some of the data available to us today. And so we should probably just require that education from the start because we don't want kids to have, 5 years of bad education before they're like mandatorily pulled out of homeschooling before, they have to have all that catch up time. And obviously that's bad for their long-term outcomes. Like, to me, that's why I would say you have to combine testing with some sort of parental requirement, curricular requirement. And to be fair, like a testing requirement is just an implicit curricular requirement as well. If you're going to test on Algebra 2, English 2, physics, American history one year, well, you're basically saying you're required to teach it. And so again, just the front end and the back end matters in terms of regulation, if you ask me.
I don't think the front end matters. I think the back end is what we're looking at. And at most, what you can say is, every 5 years, well, we don't want the kid having shit education for 5 years. Like, well, this could maybe, we could come up with some kind of good faith compromise here of like, okay, well, when the kid's younger, right, maybe the testing is more frequent, right? Or maybe like we're looking for warning signs or like, hey, between 4th and 8th grade, the kid, like we test every year. Once you hit high school, like the testing becomes less frequent. I'm open to that. And in fact, I'd be even more on board with testing every year than I would be requiring a degree from the parents, right? Because again, even though under this requirement, like I could homeschool kids, right? I wouldn't want to dictate to somebody who was educating their kids, like at least to the minimum that we would expect people to understand. But hey, they don't, they immigrated here and they don't have the piece of paper, or they don't have the degree, but their kids are still excelling. I'm not going to be the kind of person that's going to say, no, you can't do this anymore. Mm-hmm. I'm not even going to say like you have to go take some, even if it's like a 12-week course or something, unless the kid is demonstrating issues, right? Then at that point, we can have a conversation of like, okay, how do we fix this problem? So that's my position on that. When it comes to requiring evolution, now I'm a red-blooded atheist, okay, just like most fedora-wearing libertarians of my allies. Okay. But that being said, right, freedom of religion is a guaranteed First Amendment right. And there's also, religion is a fundamental cultural construct. And I'm uncomfortable, and it gets really messy when we're starting to talk about maybe deconstructing pretty base level cultural constructions that like communities have, right? So one example I can think of would be, I'll just assert this. I think that if we were to assert this standard on the Amish and we were to say, look, you guys can't teach like creationism or you guys can't teach religion here. I mean, how far removed is that from some sort of perhaps, I don't know, minor like, let me ask you, do you think what China's doing to like the Muslims in Xinjiang, do you think that's like, if they're deconstructing their like Islamic beliefs, is that some level of cultural genocide?
Okay, so obviously what's happening in Xinjiang is a cultural genocide. I would say so. I think that it's really a matter of how we compartmentalize culture, essentially, and like what we view like the role of the state is, and to some degree, like if we even believe in, like to what degree do we believe in democracy, right? Because some people will say like the Constitution is an anti-democratic document, right? It's almost a check on the democratic elements that we might see pervasive in our society if we had more majoritarian democracy. And so, given that we have, like, to me, this is just what I evaluate is like, okay, well, how do cultures thrive in more majoritarian systems? Well, it seems like they thrive just as well as they do in our current system, right? If we look at majoritarian democracies, proportional representation systems, it doesn't seem like there's often a demand for like getting rid of civil liberties or culturally genociding huge portions of the population. Now, if we were to define basically getting rid of religious education as a cultural genocide, well, I guess, sure, you could say that's cultural genocide, but I just simply wouldn't say it's the same thing. I would say that when I view education, I view it again as a public good, as something with a social purpose, at the very least with minimum requirements. I'm not making it illegal for you to turn around and tell your kid evolution is fake and creationism is the real thing, but I'll tell you the same thing that my Texas biology teacher told me in high school, and this was like the first day that we started learning about evolution in high school. Of course, we had learned about it in elementary school, but this was just her introduction. She said, look, to anybody whose parents have a problem with me teaching evolution, you don't have to believe what I'm saying. Your story of creation is something you have every right to believe in. It's just that something for the purposes of a holistic biology education that you have to learn is this scientific theory of evolution. And when I ask you descriptive questions about that theory, I will test you on whether or not descriptively you can answer questions about evolution. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't think that that puts you in a weird spot in terms of your religious beliefs or anything like that. Frankly, I would just rely on the fact that, the overwhelming majority of Christians send their kids to public school and don't have a problem with these requirements. And that's the same thing in every other developed country, which, every developed country has a public education system as well. And so that's how I would respond to that. I just don't think it's as big a deal as you're letting on. And I don't think most people actually have a big problem with it.
I don't disagree with that answer. That's reasonable.
There we go. We may have hit rock bottom here, Duke. I don't know. Unless you have anything else you wanted to bring up, Black Toy, we can talk to the audience questions or whatever.
Yeah, but it's probably a good spot to end anyway. Take some time. Do you guys have any more closing statements you want to do? Like a little short one?
I mean, I could just.
I'm good to skip them or.
Yeah, I could just reiterate.
Just do like an elevator speech. Yeah, like a 30-second bit.
And then Econoboi can give his, and I'm sure partially respond to mine. I guess just by and large, based on my review of the literature, it's definitely the literature, I agree, is not particularly high quality, regardless of which literature it is, which is uncomfortable, right? It's uncomfortable whenever we're trying to look at normative statements about the future of education for children, right, which is a group that we should absolutely care about, and we don't have a lot of good data to roll with. So my first proposal is that we get some good fucking data on this, right? That's what I would like to see happen most. But with the data that we have now, based on my review and based on just the discussion as well, I believe that overall the information appears to indicate that homeschooling is not a net bad. And in fact, it appears to either be kind of mixed 50-50 or even potentially a net good. Now, even if it was slightly a net bad, right, which I don't believe it is, it definitely has not hit any threshold that I think is needed to have the state, which is a coercive entity, interfere in the lives of parents and their children. And so at this stage, although I'm reasonable in discussing some bare minimum regulations, I suppose, on testing, I think anything else is just unneeded at this point and frankly unjustified.
Yeah, and I guess to round it out on my end of the spectrum, I would just say that the aggregate amount of evidence is pretty low quality, and there's not really a lot of it. I would agree with that. But that's why I do lean heavily on this literature review that I posted. And the reason is because it seems like the researchers take a very hands-off view. They try to evaluate the quality of evidence that is available, and they also try to evaluate, they're not lobbyists. They're not like trying to make homeschooling seem bad or make it seem good. They're just trying to sort of, in a detached fashion, evaluate the quality of evidence. And what they find is that the quality of evidence is low on aggregate. The quality evidence that we do have points to serious gaps in the homeschooling system that we have today, which has to do oftentimes with how parental qualification is regulated and the types of curriculum they learn and the motivations with why parents take their kids out of the public or private sort of collective school system, you could say. And so insofar as those things matter a lot in terms of outcome, and the quality evidence points us to that direction, and insofar as we have the overwhelming majority of the states failing in essentially one, two, or all three of those aspects of education in terms of how they regulate homeschooling, I would say that we've got a bad system, right? That we've got some holes in our system that are serious. And what is it, like 5 or 10% of students are homeschooling, and that number is increasing each year, the proportion. And so insofar as that's the case, the demand for this type of regulation should increase as well, ideally, because those potential negative problems could be magnified with more people entering that market and the quality of, the sort of average quality of that going down. And so that's my whole position, is that we need some serious regulation in terms of homeschooling. We don't necessarily need to ban it completely, But I would say there's a compelling argument for increasing the regulation. And, if federal regulation is too audacious for Democrats in Congress to support, well, at the very least, if you live in one of these underregulated states, then, maybe write a letter to your state rep and start bringing up this issue. So.
I think that'll do it then. Got a few questions and comments. If you had one that you wanted, please shoot me a DM. All right, let's see.
Can I ask, Duke, why is it with all the, like, every debate I've had here, I'm the only one with the camera? What's that all about?
True.
I don't know. You tell me. All right. First one is from Dread Assassin to Econoboi. Don't you think it's a good thing for some kids who want to be in homeschooling so they don't have to be stressed out from a potential school shooting? If you want kids to not be homeschooled, then the current school system should be improved for the future generations, right?
Well, again, I think it comes down to effective regulations for either one, right? So I think the question is more so like, can we regulate public schools to such a degree that they are safe, right? And, the answer seems to be yes. Like, it seems like there's more and less safe ways to manage schools. Now, from a school district level, you can't like institute gun reform that would eliminate school shootings, right? So you can only do the best you can in that regard. But I would just say the same thing. If a parent is so, deathly worried about their kid dying in a school shooting, hey, totally fair enough, right? Because that shit happens seemingly on a monthly basis here in this country. But at the same time, like, we have to care about quality of outcomes. What is the actual probability of your kid dying in a school shooting? Like, it's actually pretty low. And at the same time, like, what's your probability of probably giving your kid a worse education because you're not qualified to give your kid a good education, because your kid isn't tested on what he knows? Like, the probability of that happening is actually decently high. And so, weighing the outcomes, it seems like you'd still advocate for not just a better regulatory state in terms of homeschooling, but that's totally compatible with arguing for better regulations for public school safety and, things like that as well.
Okay. Let's see. Oh, I think PZH had one somewhere in the chat. Yeah, I think it's to both, I think. PZH asks if we can agree that parents in general care for their children, then why would we need to regulate parents instead of perhaps offering them information to homeschooling parents to get good results? I assume Lactoid would already just kind of agree with this, so mostly to Econoboi.
Well, if I could, I agree that generally speaking, parents are the people that are most involved in their children's lives, and should be, and it's a good thing when they are. At the same time, I'm also not advocating for the abolition of CPS, right? There are people who should not be parents and are terrible parents, and this is part of the reason why, minimal testing requirements, I'm not necessarily opposed to. But again, I just want to emphasize minimal, because as long as the child is getting the education and we can see that they're getting the minimal required education, then the state should not be involved.
Yeah, I really hate this anarchist libertarian argument that some people give is like, don't parents love their kids more than anyone else? How does the state love kids more than their parents? And it's like, well, obviously, like Lactoid mentioned, there's kind of two forms of abuse that we could imagine in terms of the average sort of household, right? One form of abuse is just like the very evil form of abuse of like, I hate my kids for one reason or another, and I get weird sadistic pleasure in abusing them, right? And so that's bad. Obviously, you need regulations for that. And that's one thing that we mentioned, earlier in this debate, which is that it seems like those kinds of people are like disproportionately very likely to want to homeschool their kids. Again, that's not to speak on the absolute figures. Most homeschool students aren't abused by their parents in the way that I'm describing, obviously. And so, it's just to say that that's definitely something we would care about and probably want to regulate, right? And then the other form of abuse is like parents who think they're doing what's best for their kid, but really, like, it's probably objectively speaking not the best thing for their kid. Like, and we can imagine, different scenarios where this could be the case. Like, and people disagree on this, right? So obviously it's a democratic debate, I guess. But, like if a parent, I don't know, like if there are some parents who make their kids work from a very early age to like support the household and like make their older kids take care of their younger kids, right? This is something where we would say like this is probably like a very bad parenting decision for a number of reasons, right? But, parents have some broad rights to do things like that, and like, how do we regulate that? It's an open question. Like, some parents might not think that drinking from a young age is a big deal. Like, I've heard many stories like, in France, it's totally normal for 14-year-olds to just like have a bunch of wine with their parents for dinner and stuff like that. And again, like that's one of those things like maybe it is okay, but also probably they shouldn't be drinking from such a young age. Like, should we just allow parents to give their kids alcohol from a very, very young age? Like, probably not. There's videos of parents giving their kids drugs and stuff, and that's probably not good. And so, it's just like obviously the case that sometimes parents make really bad decisions with their kids, and sometimes those decisions are so bad that it leads to the need for uh, a regulatory state. I see PZH, you're saying regulate all parents. It's like, yeah, dumbass. Like, obviously we need, oh, you're saying you shouldn't be able to rape your kids? What are you, some kind of fascist? Like, what are you saying, PZH? Are you fucking dumb fuck? Like, it's just a genuine question. Like, obviously we need some sort of regulations for parenting and parenting behavior. Jesus Christ,
Right.
PZH. Like, I just don't know where you're coming from.
I don't even know who you're referring to, but I'm going to defend him for a second.
Not you, like I'm the PZH.
No. I know.
Jesus
I don't even know who this person is, but I'm going to defend him for a second. So sure, you can have some level of regulation, right? But and I've done a little bit of research into this, so please feel free to correct me. But based on the reviews I've seen, there's actually not a whole bunch of data indicating that CPS is particularly effective at overall outcomes for the children, unless we're talking like severe level abuse. So when you're talking about like the wine, for example, I can agree with you that yes, overall it would be better if the kids just didn't drink alcohol at all, for sure. I in my state, as long as you're with your parents, you can drink at any age, which is crazy, right? Including in a bar in a public place. But there's some level in which enforcement, like the cure, becomes worse than the disease, right? Like
Of course.
having a state apparatus like CPS coming in and like laying down the law on parents who give like their kid like a beer. This would be just a horrible outcome, and it was such a bad outcome that we essentially might as well legalize it.
Well, some regulatory, I mean, like for instance, child marriage. Like people talk about this. Like some people take very like anti-Christian views because so many states allow child marriage with like parental consent. Like I would say that that's an area where, like, yeah, I guess if because of religious reasons you think it's okay for your 14-year-old to marry this 20-year-old, like, I remember this is a totally anecdotal experience, but it speaks to the regulations that are available. I remember watching this incredibly trashy reality TV show with my wife. It's one of our guilty pleasures, and this lady was talking about getting her, I think she was literally 14-year-old daughter, like married to this 21-year-old. And legally speaking, it seemed like that was perfectly okay based on the state regulation. And like, yeah, you can make the argument, oh, that's a parental decision. This 14-year-old, I guess, is past puberty. So maybe that's like makes it okay for some reason. But like, I would just say, yeah, like I'm saying, as not the parent of that child, I'm saying that shouldn't be allowed. Right. And if somebody says I'm an authoritarian, and you're not saying this like, but like if somebody says, "Oh, you're being authoritarian, you think the state should be in parental decisions," like, okay, I guess so. I just don't think 14-year-olds should be able to be married to grown men or just in general, right? And that's a moral decision I'm making. That's a moral decision I'm obligating parents to make. I'm saying that as a non-parent. And I'm just okay with saying that, I guess, right? And there's a line where some people disagree with, and maybe a lot of people disagree with what I just said, but I mean, God, that just fucking seems wild to me that we allow parents to make certain decisions like that, and it's just totally allowed, I mean, that's fucking crazy to me, but greater minds disagree. That's why a lot of states allow that kind of thing. So
Okay. Let's see. I think I have one from Admiral. Okay, Admiral says, in the study of interpersonal relationships, it's well understood that one partner attempting to isolate the other is a method of abuse. Now imagine the type of narcissist that looks at their child and says, during your development, I should be your only conduit to the wider world. Why would the state allow this, or why should the state allow this sort of child abuse in the form of homeschooling? I assume this is more towards Lactoid.
Well, one of the issues, I guess, with this is not only could you say this about education, you could say this about the nuclear family generally, right? Like, yeah, parents are going to assert a level of control and guardianship over their parents. But if we're going to say that this is isolation, right? This is preventing contact with the outside world. This is inherently abusive. The reality is actually the opposite. Homeschooled families tend to be more civically involved than non-homeschool families. Homeschooled kids are definitely involved in the community. They report higher rates of volunteering. They report higher rates let's stick with volunteering. There's a couple other things listed as well, that there actually is, like, homeschooled kids are more involved in the community on average. So is it a level of isolation to some extent? I suppose you're denying your kid access to other kids in a public education. But again, not only could you say this about all parenting, but then the flip side is the first part of what was just said of, the single conduit of information, right? Well, that's what you're essentially advocating for the state doing, right? The state becoming the single conduit for information. And I think that there is a reasonable fear. There is a reasonable fear of what the state puts in the education curricula and what they don't. And it only takes someone like Ron DeSantis for a left winger to agree with me and to say, well, actually, yeah, you're right. I don't like the fact the state's like dictating what kids should learn. And then the right winger is going to say, well, yeah, but what about all the other shit that, like, you're dictating my kids learn, blah, 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 back and forth. There's always going to be a single conduit of information to some extent when it comes to education.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that it's interesting that so when I was looking into the literature on this, I was expecting the evidence on socialization to be significantly more clear than the evidence on academic achievement, and what I found was kind of the opposite. And that was very surprising to me, and the only reason that was surprising to me was because I feel like we all have and this it could be wrong, but, like, it seems like literally every single person in America, if they're not a homeschool kid, has, like, experiences where they've interacted with homeschool children who have, like, gone from homeschool to public school, or they interact with them in a extra social gathering, like at a church or at a, whatever, at a rally or something like that, or at a concert. And it feels like we all have stories about, like, man, it just seems like homeschool kids are a little bit weird. Like, it seems like their socialization's a little bit off, and subreddits like homeschool recovery exist, and it feels like homeschoolers have a problem with socialization. But when you look into the actual evidence, what you'll find is that it's oftentimes very mixed, right? But one of the reasons that it's mixed is for the same exact reason that I mentioned earlier with the academic literature, was that it seems to depend greatly on what we think of as proper socialization, and, like, how we would define if a kid is well socialized or not. And it would also depend on the metrics by which we determine if they have proper socialization. So, to quote from one of the studies that I have here, there was a 2014 study, and it drew from a different large-scale data set. And what they find is kind of similar to what Lactoy was mentioning, but there's some caveats to it. Religious homeschoolers were 2.5 times more likely, less religious homeschoolers were 2.5 times more likely than less religious conventionally school adolescents to have no curricular participation. More religious homeschoolers, however, were 60% less likely to be isolated than their more religious conventionally schooled counterparts, which is to say that the mode of homeschooling seems to find that you actually get a bit less isolation and a little bit more extracurricular involvement if you're a homeschool parent. What these researchers often find is that that's because homeschool parents are so concerned about socialization of their homeschool kids. They tend to make extraordinary efforts to socialize their kids that public school parents and private school parents often don't. However, what they found was that church-related extracurriculars were the sole connection for 21% of these homeschoolers. And so what that tells me is that it's probably more likely the case that homeschool kids find themselves in bubbles, but not necessarily that they find themselves totally socially isolated, like they're just in their room and they come out to do homeschooling and then they're back in their room all day. Like, that's the caricature of homeschooling that we oftentimes talk about, and that doesn't seem to be true. But they certainly seem to be in bubbles a lot more. And the Cardis survey that we talked about, the best long-term data on socialization as well as academic outcomes, found that religious homeschoolers expressed less clarity about their goals and less sense of direction, along with lower efficacy in dealing with life's problems and a higher divorce rate, actually, than their non-homeschool counterparts. So in the socialization data, there's some clear conclusions, but there's a lot of vagary as well. And it's a matter of how we regulate it and the context by which a kid finds themselves in homeschooling. It's not really fair just to say, oh, if you're homeschooled, you're going to be, like, socially autistic for the rest of your life. Like, that's probably not a fair statement like some people make, but it is fair to say that you do have certain socialization challenges as a homeschool kid that you don't have as a public school kid that are important to fill those gaps if you choose to homeschool your kid.
And then I'm not necessarily saying that's wrong. The author of that survey, David Sickink, later posted an article in which he goes over those specific claims and just essentially disagrees with them, and just said that the information specifically about feeling helpless was one of the claims, feeling helpless and lacking goals. There is a difference, but the difference is not statistically significant. And there's other things such as feeling thankful or feeling positive that were just ignored in a lot of the anti-homeschooling data.
Yeah, like one of the consistent findings in homeschooling literature is that homeschool kids oftentimes have a greater sense of independence. That they're oftentimes better at essentially entertaining themselves and being sure of their own decisions than public school kids, because obviously in a more collaborative environment, you're more used to relying on other people, whereas in a homeschool environment, you're kind of more forced to solve your own problems. So the evidence is mixed, right? It's just that homeschool kids have unique challenges, and that's why I say that there's probably room for changes in public school sort of curricula and modes of instruction, and of course, at the same time, there's just rooms for regulation for how homeschool kids are treated as well.
Cool.
All right, Duke, any more questions?
Let's see. Yeah, I think I got 2 more. We'll try to go through them fast.
Let's do
First
it.
one was from Prado. Lactoid, you said the bottom 1% of public schools do worse than the bottom 1% of homeschooled students. He wanted to know if you knew the same kind of thing for the bottom 10% and the bottom 25%.
To be clear, that was a hypothetical. So I don't know.
Gotcha.
I don't know actually if the bottom 1% of homeschool kids do better or worse than the bottom 1% of public school kids. I'm skeptical, and this is part of, again, this comes from the data not necessarily existing, right? I went to a lower performing high school. I don't know. Maybe this is somewhat colored by my anecdotal experience. I've seen a lot of fuck ups. I saw a lot of people get involved in drugs. A lot of people get involved in gangs and violence, bringing guns to school, a lot of gang affiliation. And so, is it true that yes, there's going to be a bottom floor for homeschool kids? And is it possible that could be even lower than this? Sure. But I mean, it's hard to imagine something lower than getting hooked on fentanyl and getting shot.
Okay. Last question, I think, from Demon McLennan. Asks, what are the fundamental concepts that all homeschooling parents should teach to kids as a standard, i.e., what emotional, social, physical, cognitive, and language requirements?
Yeah, I guess that's probably more of a question for me, because I'm the one saying there should be some minimum standards in that regard. So I would say, I'm not an educational expert. I would say that intuitively, kids should probably learn things like, a regular English class, learning how to read and write, and not just read and write, but also analyze literature. That's a really important skill that is frankly not taught as much as it should be, probably in public schools as well, like critical thinking ability, let's say. History courses, world history, U.S. history, probably some state level history requirements, typically like we have in public schools as well. That's probably important. I would say having some cultural education as well, like learning about, descriptive facts about these are the major celebrations of other cultures and other religions. And, this is what, Islam and Christianity and these are the basic tenets of belief. I learned that in a public school setting and seemed fine and pretty interesting as well. Basic science education, physics, biology, chemistry, stuff like that is probably important for kids to learn. I would say math, all the way from basic math all the way up to maybe calculus would probably, let's say basic calculus would probably be a good track for most kids to have a basic sort of, education on. Let's say, essentially just learning basic sort of school math is probably important. Maybe a language requirement if you think that's important. Personally, I don't think that's quite as important, but, maybe having them take a couple Spanish classes or something like that could make sense. And then in terms of socialization, yeah, I mean, I would say that it would probably behoove the state to create sort of apparatuses of social engagement. And I think most homeschooling how do I put this? Like most homeschooling apparatuses have something like this, like they have, homeschool football leagues and homeschool debate leagues and stuff like that, where, you can still do extracurriculars. And I would maybe go as far as to say is that I'm so concerned about the socialization of homeschool children. Maybe it should be a requirement that they do some sort of extracurricular, like just anything, right? But just something that gets them out of the house. And, that could be volunteering. It could be an extracurricular, but, something like that, just to make sure that you don't have that worst example of, just a homeschool kid just isolated in their house all day is probably a bad thing. And so stuff like that, I would say would be, roughly where I would start in terms of the minimum education sort of curricular requirements and socialization requirements for homeschool kids. And to be fair, one of the things that the last thing I'll say is that on socialization, one thing that the literature finds is that a lot of homeschool kids are counted as homeschool kids, but they actually are in this like sort of flexible education sort of system where it's like they're homeschooled, 80% of the time, but then sometimes the homeschool kids all are in one classroom learning the same thing at the same time. Sometimes homeschool kids go to public school for certain subjects, but not others. And like that would make total sense, like if you're really, if you feel like as a teacher, as a homeschool parent teacher, you don't know shit about calculus, but that's a required thing. Yeah, I mean, maybe just send your kid to like the one calculus class every, day for an hour and a half or however long the class is at the high school. Like that probably makes a lot of sense, especially if you feel like you're not confident as a parent in your ability to teach certain advanced subjects like physics and calculus and trigonometry. But that actually already happens a lot with homeschool parents because, again, like most homeschool parents aren't complete dumbasses, right? And who are like these caricatures on like CNN who are like, well, I just don't believe in the public education because of grooming and all the gay shit. And like most homeschool parents aren't quite so awful. And so, but having some requirements like that probably makes some sense to me.
And then, not entirely off. Again, there's obviously going to be some base level agreement here. There's just difference in scale. I think it's reasonable to have basic math comprehension testing, and probably some basic reading comprehension testing as well. Science as well. I do agree that at the very least, students should be able to, even if they don't personally believe it, they should be able to at least accurately recount what is the prevailing scientific opinion. When it comes to history, I'm in favor of history being taught. One of the issues, though, that I'm running into a little bit is I think when it comes to teaching history, this is, I think, the prime example of where people do need to be skeptical of what the state's interests are, right? Because the state's history curriculum is going to be obviously based on the interests of the state. Now, again, a lefty will agree with me if I talk about how the South teaches facts, or at least maybe not so much anymore, but at least for many decades taught facts that were explicitly pro-Confederate, right? I mean, right now, I'm sure you could find history textbooks that say that slavery was not a major cause of the Civil War, which is just factually incorrect, right? And so there's that aspect, but you can also be concerned about the other way around, right? So like in my history classroom, we spent a lot of time learning about a lot of things, but there were a lot of things that were omitted. And the things that were omitted, I believe, were critical context to understand the actual political outcomes of those historical realities. And obviously the state, if they have a particular interest one way or the other, they're going to shy away from the history that's less convenient for them or less convenient to their agenda. And they're going to focus more on the history that's more important for their agenda. They may not be lying at all, right? But if the history curriculum, for example, let's say, is like nothing but nothing but slavery being bad, right? Someone's going to walk away with that with a warped understanding of America as being just nothing but this evil slaving country, right? And then at the same time, if you have a history textbook that says, the Confederacy was good, you're going to have people walking away with not even believing slavery happened or not even believing slavery was a major cause of the Civil War. So I think we should be super skeptical of what history is being taught, and I'm much more willing to grant vast deference to parents to teach what history as long as the history is accurate.
Cool. All right. Let's close up shop up here. But as always, we'll move down to a post-debate VC for anyone who wants to keep this going. If both of you are wanting to stick around for a bit. I think there might have been one more person that wanted to speak in voice. So we'll see when we get there. But regardless, thank you guys for showing up. This was a good and fun debate. And as always, I appreciate it when my moderation job is basically non-existent. So that's always a good sign. So that's nice. And see you guys next week or in the VC down below.
Alrighty, fun time.
See if she shows up. I know that there's one oh yeah, there we go. She's here.
Hi, Loctoid.
Hey,
Oh
what's
my
up?
goodness.
All right, so I have a question about your 1%, 10%, 20%. While I probably would agree with you that the bottom 1, maybe even bottom 5% of public school students probably do have worse outcomes than the bottom 1 or 5% of homeschool students. Again, just kind of off anecdotal and like, my own personal experience, but generally I think that's probably true. I feel like this trend probably at some point turns around in that, like, my guess is the top, on the top side, that public school students do better than homeschooled students. How do you feel about
Just
that?
based on I mean, if we're just going off anecdotal like intuition statements, I disagree. Some of the smartest people I've ever run into were homeschooled, at least in law school. Like they were just killing it. It's crazy. But this is part of the problem is the data is not very good in this, so I just don't know what the
Yeah.
objective answer
Right,
is.
right. This is right. This is the hard part. Is it really does seem like the data is just non-existent.
Yeah, and if anything, if this this debate was hey, let's go get more data, I would be arguing the pro 100%.
I had a question. So unfortunately, I missed most of what your debate was, but and this is not a debatey question. It's just more of a general question. I wondered what you found out regarding what homeschool kids' lives are like in adulthood. So what their parenting styles typically are, what their marital outcomes are. Are they more likely to homeschool their kids, or are they more likely to send their kids to public school? What are their mental health outcomes are? What do these kids typically look like when they reach adulthood? What are their lives typically like? Do they typically seem to be in better shape than your average public school kid, or no?
So the data here again is mixed, and I think Econoboi would probably emphasize the data that indicates negative outcomes. But even those studies that indicate negative outcomes still indicate it's very mixed, right? So you have these weird contradictions where, although it's very very minor, it's not even like statistically significant. You have homeschool kids more likely to rate their lives as more helpless, but they have lower rates of depression. So it's like, okay, this is a weird contradiction, but that's how the data plays out. They tend to be more forgiving, more charitable. They tend to go to, again, like I said during the debate, it is true, homeschool kids do attend college less often than kids who are not homeschooled. But it's unclear as to whether or not this in of itself actually has some kind of deleterious effect, or whether it's actually a good thing. Because although college is generally good for the average, it might not necessarily be good for the lower end, right? They may actually just be spinning their wheels and wasting money when they could be doing something more profitable. Homeschooled kids do tend to be more involved in the community, for sure. They tend to vote in local elections slightly more. They tend to rate themselves as more thankful that they were homeschooled compared to public education students, who tend to report themselves less thankful that they were educated in a public school. And they are equally likely to have a friend that's a minority. So I found that one interesting, but it's true.
Are the Amish considered a minority in that methodology?
It said racial minority, but I don't know if
Yeah, my question stands. The German race of the Amish people.
Maybe, I don't know.
Oh, I had a question that Duke ignored.
Oops. Go for it.
Oh, sorry, I wasn't sure if I was audible. Do you guys have thoughts or any opinions about compulsory education in general?
Highly in favor, personally.
Based.
Yeah, as long as the homeschooling option remains viable and within reach of everybody, I think it makes sense. Yeah,
Okay.
I don't like the idea of like an 18-year-old having been destroyed basically because they can't do math or can't read or can't do anything.
Right. Yeah, lactoid, Wisconsin versus Yoder is the court case that actually allowed the Amish to not have to put their kids in public schools.
Now they educate those kids though, and they.
Yeah.
I actually had a lawsuit where a Amish dude was a witness, and he was talking a little bit about his life. And dude, these guys are fucking productive. Like all they do is just wake up and work all day long, building shit, slaughtering cows. It's crazy. And then they're like, go to bed and do the next thing the next morning.
I have another question. I know that I was a homeschooled kid, and I know that like when we lived in Alaska, my family actually received a stipend. We received a stipend to buy books. We received a stipend from the state for educational materials from the state. Is that something that you think is a good thing, or is that something that you think that, or should parents, if they choose to homeschool, should they have to supply it for themselves?
Econoboi, I don't know if you wanted to answer that first. I just saw that you undeafened, but I can answer it.
Yeah, so the question is, I guess, like, should public funds be available for homeschooling parents fundamentally? Or did I miss the question?
Yes. So that's fundamentally the question. So, like in Alaska, for instance, so I'm looking at this right now. Ideas Alaska homeschool allotment is now $2,700 for all students K through 12, the 2023 through 2024 school year. So you can receive a stipend to help offset fund costs if you choose to homeschool in Alaska. And I was wondering if that was something you felt was a good thing to do, or if you think that parents should ultimately subsidize their own child's education if they choose to homeschool.
I think that argument would be significantly more compelling if it was a state with like stricter requirements. Like Alaska is one of these states that has basically no homeschooling requirements, it seems like, at least based off of this map, where it shows that there's like no parental qualification requirements, there's no requirements for curricula that's instructed, and there's no like testing requirements either. And so if you're basically saying like, should parents get money from the state basically just because they say they're homeschooling their kids, but we have no ability to determine the quality of that education or what they're learning, I would say probably not. But if you're talking about a regulatory state that I'm more in favor of, where you basically have to demonstrate qualification and you have to demonstrate quality of education and you have to teach them certain things, I think that makes a lot more sense. And I think especially in the circumstances, and I'll say especially so in the circumstances where there's a more material need for homeschooling, like if a kid is like severely autistic and just like literally cannot function in a social environment, or if like, because sometimes you'll find parents who homeschool not because of maybe their kid is poorly socialized, but because their kid is special needs and has special curricular requirements, but the public school just doesn't offer those requirements. Well, at that point, yeah, I would say certainly it makes a lot of sense, especially with the regulatory state that I would recommend, that a parent would get some some sort of assistance from the state to facilitate that education. Because again, I'm all about just outcomes, like whatever ensures the most number of kids are well educated, well prepared to basically be productive, independent adults. That's generally what I'm going to support.
I think I agree. But in terms of providing stipends, but I think it probably could be less. Just the cost differential in terms of educating a child through homeschooling compared to like a public education is pretty stark. Like that was one thing I consistently found there's a pretty wide gap there. I mean, in the U.S. we spend like over 14 grand per student per year, and for homeschooling it's like a fraction, like $600, $700.
Yeah.
So I mean,
there's no administrative overhead, right? So
Right.
that kind of makes sense, right?
Yep.
There's no utility bills, there's no teachers being paid, there's no administrators, I mean, there's no school board you have to pay or anything like that. So yeah, it kind of makes sense that you wouldn't give homeschool parents like $14,000 a year to educate their kid. That'd be pretty crazy. What was the proposal in Alaska, Ferry? Was it like just like the per head count funding, we're going to give that to the homeschool teachers, or was it like, no, we're going to give them $400 a month or something, like a much more modest amount of money.
Honestly, I don't know. I just remember hearing that, like when I was a homeschooled kid, and I remember that was something that helped my mom when she chose to homeschool us. I guess I have a follow-up question to you, Econoboi, because you mentioned that for you, you wanted to see that the teacher in question had a credential, or the parent in question should have a teaching credential before they chose to homeschool. I know, at least like for my mom and for other parents that I knew, because we were in community with them, like when we homeschooled, many parents were in the process of receiving a credential. So my mom was not qualified to teach, but she was going to school to become a teacher. And I know that there are programs, like I work as a teacher now, where you can teach, but you have to prove that you have like an intermittent certification before you finish your certificate. Is that something that you think would be okay in terms of homeschooling? And even and I guess my next question would be, like, when we're thinking about homeschooling, then would you only therefore be okay with like a with somebody who has like a K-8 qualification, like to be an elementary school teacher? So if we have, for instance, somebody like, so if you're homeschooling through high school, for instance, right? Like obviously the qualifications in order to be like a high school English teacher is going to be very different as opposed to if you want to be an elementary school teacher or a kindergarten teacher, right? And the kind of education that you receive in order to be prepared is going to be different depending on the grade level that you teach, right? So even if you do have somebody that like does have that qualification, they're probably not going to have it for all grade levels, and they're probably not going to be they're probably, like, even if they are a good teacher and even if they do have that qualification, they're probably not going to be trained for all grade levels. I just wondered if like that was something that you thought about or discussed.
Yeah, I mean, having some sort of stepladder or like periodic, because I think it probably wouldn't make sense to just be like, oh, you have a 4-year degree in mathematics, so like you're just automatically eligible to educate your child in all subjects for like 18, or well, not 18, but like for 13 or 14 years straight of like progressively more diverse and difficult, education. Like I would say, and I haven't seen a lot of literature on like what's the best sort of like training requirements for educators in general. Like some people will say every teacher needs a master's degree and also needs an education degree. And if you're going to be a elementary school teacher, you need a subject specialty and education degree, and you need like an early childhood education specialty as well. Like maybe that is the right thing to do, but I'm very open to what the training requirements should be. What you're saying kind of intuitively makes sense, where as your kid gets older, as those curricula demands change, that you're probably need to come back and like do training in other subjects and do different types of training as the kid gets older. Like that probably makes sense to me. And so, it's just a matter of the literature just isn't quite there. Like if I had to define a set of training expectations today for a teacher or for a homeschool teacher, I would probably make it a lot of different potential requirements. So for instance, let's say, I don't know. Let's say that you had a master's degree from an accredited university, and you're willing to come in and take a 12-week sort of quick pedagogy course sponsored by whatever, a local public institution. Like, yeah, you're qualified. Let's say that you have a 4-year degree and it's in early childhood education. Well, you can skip the pedagogy course and you can just go right into teaching. Like, there'd probably be a lot of different requirements that you could have that meet the same threshold. In my view, you probably wouldn't want to make it like so one-dimensional of like, you need a bachelor's degree in education and then you're just good to go, right? Like what you're saying, that stepladder probably makes sense, and then having a diversity of sort of avenues to qualify to be a homeschool teacher probably makes sense to me as well. But 50 different states, so we can experiment with it and just kind of see what works out the best. There we go. I guess that was the fucking mic drop. Well, it was fun talking to all you guys today. It was fun to. There we go. It was fun debating you as well, Acto, and I'm gonna hop off. And maybe one day we'll talk about something different. But it was fun talking to everybody, and have a good rest of y'all's day. I'll see you later.
Thank you for sharing your insights. Bye.
For sure.
I'm gonna bounce too. I'll catch y'all later.
Bye.
Stuck out, Lactoid. See if we care. Yeah.
Fuck you.
You take it easy.
All right. Do a little bit of debriefing. So obviously there was a lot. This is like a very study war based conversation. So I'll read the 84 page from Robert Kunzman. I'm looking this guy up. He definitely has a lot of information on, or a lot of his study appears to be revolving around homeschooling. I mean, definitely, I think Econoboi even admitted that when he was reading part of it, it definitely sounded pretty like biased in terms of their, and it definitely appears that based on his like some of the titles I'm reading here and the Institute, the International Center for Home Education Research, does seem to be less in favor of homeschooling, or at least more vitriolic in its attacks on homeschooling. Is that panel being broadcast somewhere, or was it just on Discord? Well, it's being broadcast here, Mike. It's being broadcast right here on Lactoid TV, which I got a new UI. Do you see this shit? Do you see this, the cool blue galaxy with Lactoid TV at the bottom? It's a little bit better than the just chatting UI that I've had for over a year. I think this is probably a little bit better. But of course, I'm going to say that because I changed it. I like it. I like it a lot. I saw the blue background. I'm like, that is Lactoid blue. Some people say it's green. I still think cyan and turquoise. I think these are shades of blue. Fucking love it. So there's a lot of data that I just didn't fucking read off. And I'll in my Discord, what I'm going to do is in the library channel, I'm going to go ahead and just post all the links I've collected with like an indicate, like a one sentence summary of what essentially they say. But I mean, there's a couple things. It's like, I was looking at the meta-analysis, and obviously I haven't read the full meta-analysis that he was referencing, this 84-page shit. And so, but when I'm looking through like the information, the studies that it's linking are studies it's linking to things that I've looked at as well, right? And it's true 100% that those studies are mixed, right? They explicitly have mixed results. Not necessarily negative. I think that's critically important, right? Now, the commentary on this meta-analysis is clearly going to be negative. They're going to emphasize the negative portions, but they just completely ignore the positive portions. And in fact, the references to the, I think it's like really important to note that the references to the Cardiff Education Survey, the 2011 and 2014 Cardiff Education Survey, the person who did that is a man by the name of David Sinkink. And David Sinkink, that Cardiff survey was used by Elizabeth Bartholet, who's a Harvard law professor, claiming, quote, the homeschooling regime poses real dangers to children and to society, right? The author of the fucking Cardiff survey, David Sinkink, like came back and wrote a full analysis saying, actually, Bartholet's claims are bullshit, right? Here are, and I posted that in the other chat, but I'll go ahead and post it here as well. There's the IFL. Now, obviously, people are looking at that like, oh, IFS. That's not a credible source. Look at the author, right? The author is David Sinkink. Pretty directly says who it is, and you can look at the Cardiff survey, CARDUS education survey. It was done by him. So. The research that they're relying on, the people who did it are saying that they're misinterpreting a whole bunch of it, at least. What they're not misinterpreting are a few specific key things, which includes lower college education, which is interesting. And I think that's something that we should look into a little bit and find out why that is the case. But anyway, I basically made a list based on my research, based on a list of like what I was able to find, right? And so the plurality of the data that I've been able to find indicates that homeschool children are more forgiving, they're more charitable, they get better SAT, ACT scores, they're more likely to graduate. Homeschooling saves the government money. Homeschool children are much less likely to do drugs and alcohol. Homeschool children are less likely to undergo sexual abuse. Homeschool families are more involved in the community. Homeschoolers volunteer more. Homeschoolers believe in freedom of speech more, which is interesting. Homeschoolers are equally likely to have a friend of another race as public school students. This is important because a lot of people will claim that like it's the Nazis that are homeschooling their kids. We've got to protect them. Reality, most homeschool kids are just raised by normal people who aren't Nazis. Homeschoolers are more thankful, and although there is a very, very slight difference in feeling helpless or lacking goals, these aren't statistically significant, and homeschoolers exhibit less depression on average. They also exhibit fewer behavioral problems and have higher reading and language scores for sure, and a lot of studies indicate they have higher math scores. But that last one, the math scores, is in contention, right? A lot of people who are against homeschooling or look at the anti-homeschooling research or the more mixed research more favorably, it appears to indicate that yes, the reading and language comprehension is higher, but the math is a little bit lower, slightly lower. I want to point that out. So we have some saying that it's a little bit lower. We have some saying it's a little bit higher. But all studies agree that there's other aspects that homeschool children do better in. So I just wanted to rattle off that list because obviously I'm not going to have a chance to do that in the middle of a debate because it's going to be, point by point, discussion by discussion. Okay, let me look at the chat real quick. Fixed cost portion that could stay on platforms. Did we discuss The Well-Trained Mind by Susan Wise Bauer? That's a book that supports homeschooling specifically through the lens of classical education. I have not. I didn't bring that up because I didn't read it. It was like a little bit of a gotcha when he pointed out that the underlying 14 studies that were part of that literature review by Ray, obviously I didn't go through every one of them. I just didn't have the time. But the problem with that, though, is that the literature review has tables under each and every study that indicate what background factors are controlled for. And you can find that in the literature review. So it talks about which background factors are controlled for. So a lot of these studies, most of these studies, with the exception of only a couple, do control for background factors. So it's not just taking a survey and just blatantly comparing it. There's background factors that are controlled for most of them. And I think it wasn't accurate to say that none of them control for background factors because that's just not true. Posted it in your library. Thank you. Thank you. The library, that is open for people to post information relevant. Now, obviously, I give people a lot of latitude with posting stuff in there. Nothing against TOS, thank you. But I do give people a lot of latitude when it comes to posting factual information, or at least information worthy of researching further. What was the debate prompt? That was we debated about the debate prompt because the actual debate prompt was on net homeschooling is bad, and then he was taking the pro and I was taking the con. And the reason why, and I was very clear with Duke about this when we started this, I specifically said, I don't have enough information to take the positive position that homeschooling is good because I don't know if it's good, right? There's insufficient information to demonstrate that. There's definitely insufficient information to demonstrate that it's bad. And most of the information indicates that homeschooling is actually good. I got to adjust my camera off, so I apologize. Most of it actually does indicate that it's good. Because it's on net, so it makes you accept the consequential framework, which it does, right? It's about net. So on net, I think most evidence shows that it's good. The problem is all the evidence is like bad. The ones referenced by his meta-analysis, the ones referenced by my meta-analysis, they try to control for shit, but you dig into it and you're like, well, is this looking at this group of people? Is this controlling for this factor? And then it's like, no, it's not. So, and part of this has to do with the nature of homeschooling itself is sort of a little bit off the grid. And this is, I guess, a point in his favor as well, which is that the fact that it's so off the grid makes it somewhat the case that it's difficult to get a hold of information. And the fact that we don't have information kind of shields homeschooling from being called bad because we don't have any information to call it bad, which we don't. We don't have any sufficient information. Most of the information indicates that it's good. Well, I don't like that. I would like to see more information indicating what the actual truth is of it. You didn't want or take on net. It's good because of exercise of rights. I'm not going to get into, I'll get into like a rights discussion with people like Scott because he believes in rights. I'm not getting into a rights discussion with Econoboi because he repeatedly stated before that part of the debate that he is not concerned with rights. He's more concerned with outcomes. He kept saying over and over again, he's concerned with outcomes. Now, I'm kind of like a rights utilitarian in the sense that I'm also pretty concerned with outcomes. But obviously, we're going to have different concerns about outcomes, right? I'm going to be more concerned about outcomes involving rights. He's going to be more concerned about outcomes concerned with like test scores. So obviously, that's why it's on net. It's a consequentialist analysis. I'm meeting him on that battlefield. If we're going to talk about a rights analysis about whether or not homeschooling is good or bad in terms of violating people's rights, I just win the debate because public education is funded through stolen money. It's a violation of rights to steal that money. Therefore, ergo facto, blah, 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 you can't do it. And so you got to homeschool or a private school, which, I could have argued that, but then he's just going to say, well, I don't want to waste my time with this anarcho-capitalist bullshit, which honestly would have been fair because this was a discussion about on net, is it good or bad, not like Lactoid talk about how taxes are theft for the 18,000th time. One of the things I noticed is that Econoboi, I've actually, I don't know if he recalls, but I've debated him before. And he is pretty aggressive in terms of like his debating style at the beginning, but then he definitely calmed down a lot. And I noticed this so much that I made a mental note of it that I'm remembering now. He started treating me more respectfully after I mentioned that I have a doctorate. Beforehand, he was much more aggro. But then afterwards, he calmed down a lot, and he stopped. Like he started listening to what and not only was he interrupting me less, but he was more conciliatory too. Like he was, like I'd make a point in which like it was obvious what the implication was, and beforehand maybe he'd fight me on that and say like, well, no, actually you got to X Y Z, specific rhetorical, right? But then after that, he was way more conciliatory, way more good faith, and talking. And we got to a place more or less of agreement. Well, more or less. I really want to emphasize more or less of agreement because on principle, do I think there should be some level of testing? Sure. But his view of what that testing would entail is going to be wholly different than what I envision, right? It's going to be apples and oranges, right? I'm looking at, some base level testing to make sure kids aren't walking away from this stupid. And then he's going to be looking at, and he talked about it, right? He wants to have if you want to educate people or educate your own children, you're going to need to have some kind of like advanced degree or some kind of bachelor's degree. And then he also admitted, well, a bachelor's degree in math, that doesn't necessarily mean you're equipped to teach other subjects. This is one of the issues with credentialism, which is that you can be an expert in one field and a complete idiot in another, right? I don't know a lot about specific fields. And I try to stay relatively well educated, but you have instances in which, I wouldn't be wrong on a legal detail, but Corey fucking got me when it came to a hormone versus a fucking neurotransmitter, and he rubs it in every fucking time. That bastard. He fucking loves to rub it in. WTF, you still stream? You bet your ass I do. I stream every week. You could find me here, Lactoid TV. I just got a brand new UI. No more of that ugly just chatting. You can see... if I said enzyme, I'm mistaken. I meant neurotransmitter, hormone and neurotransmitter. Or is this a joke? Because I remember the joke of like, what's the difference between a hormone and a vitamin? You can't make a vitamin. Yeah, I knew that joke was coming. Okay. But anyway, I'm a big fan of the UI. I'm going to keep it for sure. That just chatting UI is gone for good. We're going to have this one be the new one for the foreseeable future. And I got good enough at image manipulation now that if I want to make a new UI, I can do it. Yep. So in fact, just to be fair, not fair, but I guess informative. I do still stream, and in fact, I am streaming tomorrow. I just got invited as we're speaking. He must have seen my debate and liked me so much. He just Prime just invited me to tomorrow's Reverie. Which I will be attending. Prime Kais is one of the coolest people on this platform. He has consistently shown himself to be, and I'm dead. He's a lefty. He is, and so he's wrong. Don't get me wrong, okay? But I mean this. Yeah, I don't know. Primes every Monday, whatever. But I'm on Primes every Monday, and I have tremendous amounts of respect for him. Not necessarily his political leaning, obviously. Just like I'm sure he doesn't like the fact that I'm, more right wing. Yes, he's a way leftist, Roland, but you got to keep in mind, right? Like he is one of the few political streamers these days that I have, and this is part of the reason why I love to go on his show, and I will continue doing so as long as he fucking invites me until the end of time. Is that he actually has like topics, not fucking drama. He has actual topics that are like political topics that are interesting to discuss. And then he doesn't like. I look. I'm not a drama streamer. And I can't do that. I understand it's a very profitable enterprise. I understand that, people have gotten really big doing that shit. And some people have made it their entire thing. I can imagine what drama alert by that one guy. Is it drama if I bring up my problems with people doing drama? I don't know. Maybe there's some kind of like Inception shit. But, anyway, it's such a pitfall because it's a sugar high, right? People get involved in the drama streams and then they do that because you get like a huge audience super quickly. But it's like daytime television, right? The kind of people that are going to be like super interested in that kind of drama stuff to the point where like they spend a considerable amount of time getting into it. They are also, in my belief, the kind of people that are also going to move on to the next drama streamer quickly, because that's how the drama cycle works, right? It's a cycle. And the moment a single drama streamer, if they can't stay relevant, if they can't stay on top of things, if they can't, if they can't know whatever the most recent drama is or have some kind of insight into it, they're going to fall by the wayside, and somebody more interesting or somebody more drama, oriented is going to pop up. And so they get this sugar high, and then there's this crash right afterwards. My experience has been that for substantive political streaming, substantive political discussions, like what we just had with Econoboi, honestly, I mean, it was very substantive. I think draws a much better group of people. I've said this time and time again. It was an offhanded like sort of joke before when I said it, but I was like, it's about the quality, not quality, not the quantity. I sincerely mean that. I think that I have one of the highest quality audiences that I've ever seen. I get interesting and important questions in chat. Feder sometimes drops funny dad jokes. I mean, that's like the exception. But hey, we need that. We need that every once in a while, okay? But I really, really do appreciate when, again, like you have people who are more interested, a little bit of an, not completely, but on average, a little bit of an older audience, I feel, just based on what I know about some of the people who are more active commentators or commenters, I suppose, in chat. Yeah. No, I love it. I love streaming. It's the coolest shit. And the fact that you guys give me your time of day is awesome. And I'm not going to stop doing it. As long as I can, as long as I draw breath, I will make it happen. Now, obviously, the question is just, well, how often can I fucking do it? Well, today is a Sunday. We actually obviously had the stream today. Tomorrow, we're going to be doing the Reverie. So that's going to be happening. What is it? 8 till 11:30 Eastern time. I do it. Obviously, I'm on Central time, so it's 7 to 10:30 for me. And then there's Wick's, the substantive Wick streams, which he does have, and they're very good. The substantive Wick streams, they come up. I don't think I have any planned this next week, but when those come up, those are great. And then I did, yeah, you did arrive at the end. I'm sorry, but I'm sticking around for a little bit. And then there is the what's his face or what's its face. I tried and I thought it went very swimmingly. When I did hosted a panel debate. Part of the problem with hosting panel debates is that, and this is partially why I make it a point to not let people down, right? If I say, I think only once in over a year have I ever told someone I was going to a panel and then said I can't. And I think that was like it was like 4 days in advance or like 5 days in advance. I gave so much time because I basically said yes, like at night. It was very late at night. And then the next morning I woke up and I was like, oh shit, I cannot make that, right? I'm going to be on a flight. And so I let him know immediately. I was like, hey, I can't, like, I'm so sorry. Like, I'll help you find a replacement. I'm so sorry. And he was super cool. It was Wick. He was super, super cool with it. So, I mean, yeah, he's a great guy. But going back to what I was saying, one of the problems with hosting a panel is that people are very flaky and people are very difficult to get to commit to come to a panel. And even if they do commit, you gotta be careful and have like, and then you don't want to, and then you really don't want to like over invite because then like if they actually do show up, then people come, but you can't have backups because then backups, it feels unfair to have somebody like have to set aside part of their time for something that they might not even go to, right? Like, I don't know, I fucking work full time, right? I would be, I find it very difficult to like schedule myself as a backup. And I only do it for people that I have I guess a working relationship with because, I'm going to give them obviously more patience than I would just somebody. A good panelist will do prep. I always do prep as well. It might not seem like it sometimes, but I always do prep, even if it's a little bit of prep. Like, so for the reveries, we all get links to articles and stuff. And I go through all the articles, and usually I'll draft an intro. The past couple times for Wix server, or for Primes, the reveries, I have winged a couple intros. And the problem is, I think it shows. There's no replacement for good prep, right? When I'm winging an intro, like it's like I can wing responses. You can't prep responses. You can't prep how a conversation is going to go. You just can't do it. But your intro, when you get like uninterrupted speaking time, you got to have something prepped. I prepped this one for sure because I had points that I just wanted to make sure I hit and wanted to make sure I go through. Reach out to Andrew for a YouTube debate on the Crucible if you want good topics. I feel as though, was it the Crucible? I think it may have been the Crucible. So I actually regret, this is a regret that I have. I'm pretty sure, and this is what happened. I was invited on a debate for the thesis was, is media the enemy of the people? And I wasn't told anything about it other than that. And it was somebody who I didn't know who reached out to me. Somebody who I didn't even know who reached out to me and was like, hey, do you believe that the media is the enemy of the people? And it's such like a broad thesis where like the concept of media, the enemy of the people, I basically fully explained my answer of like, yeah, I have problems with the media, but like the concept of media being enemy of the people, like media, I can't say that. I don't know how I would defend that premise. And then I didn't hear anything back. I think it turns out that guy was from the Crucible. He was the person who like was putting together the debate, and there was a lot of big names on that debate. So that definitely cost me some exposure. That's for sure. But it is what it is. I don't do this. I mean, I do this I guess ultimately, anytime you do any kind of streaming, it's for some level of exposure. But I would rather, again, like be principled and have a good quality group of people, as opposed to just say a bunch of shit and defend things that I don't care about or that I don't believe. Andrew Wilson. Was Andrew Wilson the guy that had the debate with Matt Dillahunty where Matt Dillahunty just basically fucking walked out? Was that Andrew Wilson? Was that guy? Yeah. So that's fucked because I really, really respected Matt Dillahunty, and then I watched that clip. I watched from the modern day debate, so I watched the whole thing. So Matt Dillahunty, for those of you who don't know, is an atheist debater who, I mean, look, it's kind of not even fair because I think atheist debaters are playing with a bit of the higher ground just in terms of like the easiness of the debate. But I mean, obviously, I think Christopher Hitchens is one of the best orators of all time. I grew up watching Christopher Hitchens. He was one of the first, like, the atheist versus Christian debates, like that were really big back in when I was in high school. That's what got me into debating. Super, I know, fedora libertarian to me, but it just is what it is. Like, I loved him, and I loved his arguments. I loved his rhetoric. He was great. And Matt Dillahunty, I didn't watch too much of his talk shows because the talk show is kind of stupid. But he did like formal debates for a little while, and he was really good. And he did a formal debate with a guy called Cy 10 Bruggengate. If you guys haven't seen the debate, I highly recommend. Matt Dillahunty versus Cy SYE 10 TEN Bruggengate or Bruggengate. I think it's Bruggengate. Who's a presuppositionalist theologist, apologist. It's a lot of words. And Matt Dillahunty is the most one-sided debate I've ever seen in my and it was especially entertaining because I had been like argued against with the presuppositionalist argument, which can be tricky if you don't know how to answer it. And I felt pretty like dissatisfied with my responses when I was talking with one of my religious friends about this specific argument in question. But it was incredibly one-sided. Matt was very much on point, very good debater, and I think it was awesome, right? And then I saw that debate between Matt and Andrew Wilson, and Matt just fucking shit the floor. He shit the bed. It was awful. You can have a problem with the rhetoric of your opponent, but there was a point that Wilson was making, and the point was a critique of Matt's point, and he just refused to see it because he wanted a grandstand about the trans issue, is what it was. He wanted a grandstand about the trans issue, and he didn't want to look like he was entertaining like the hypothetical or entertaining the obvious argument that was being presented by Wilson. And so he left. It was very frustrating. That was a very frustrating debate to watch, and I think Matt looked very poorly in that one. I think he thinks he looks better than he did. I think Andrew Wilson, to his credit, he stayed. He stayed like he said he would. And that's what you have to do. If you're I have debated, and I'm obviously not as big as Matt Dillahunty. I have debated some people who have said arguments that I personally don't find to be all that convincing. And sometimes it's borderline stupid, if we're being honest, right? Like, I'm not going to say names, but I mean, I've had debates where people sometimes make very poor arguments. But what's the goal of the debate, right? It seems like Matt's only purpose, he believes, in his debate is just to look good in front of an audience. That's why he left. But a debate needs to be more than that, right? Yes, I understand you have to be able to portray your beliefs well in order for people to not like just dismiss them if they're the correct beliefs or they're well-argued beliefs. But you also should be interested in convincing the other person, right? This is the whole point of discussion. You should be interested in trying to bring the other person to your point of view, or at least so they understand where you're coming from. And that's what everyone should do, I think. And I think if everybody debated like that, if everybody debated just trying to like bring people into like an understanding, that's like life would be better. That's why I have a principle of like, I don't say no to debating anybody unless like there's a very specific reason why, in terms of like, and usually that has requirements where if they meet the requirements, I'll still debate them. So like, hey, like I'll debate you, but you have to say that you lied about this, or you have to agree that this is what happened, because otherwise I'm not going to talk to you. And as long as they do that, right, as long as they'll just be forthright, then I'll talk to anybody. I don't care. Hitchens is awesome to listen to. He's one of the most gifted orators of all time. He has so many debates where it was just like, where I think he won often. Like there was a couple debates where he was obviously drunk, and he just won off rhetoric alone. Right? and it's kind of sad to say, but like it's true. Like he showed up there plastered because he was an alcoholic, and that the alcoholism and the heavy smoking is eventually what did him in. But he would go up there plastered, and he would just make jokes and just talk in that accent and with that manner of speaking, and the prose. That like, yeah, his prose is impeccable. It is. I mean, he could convince people of anything. I think if he was religious, he would be one of the most difficult, one of the most effective preachers. I think he's almost like an atheist preacher to some extent. Lactoid isn't a drama streamer unless dogs are the topic. True. Turquoise Galaxy background looks pretty swell. I am a big fan. I'm so glad I did it. I'm never going back. Have you read his article where he gets a manicure? I have not, but I have read his article where he basically said waterboarding is not torture, and then he went and voluntarily got waterboarded, and then afterwards he was like, "Yeah, it's torture." Like, holy shit! Like the level of honesty there. It's like, yeah, like I don't think that's torture. Why don't you just do it to me? And then like he gets it done, and he's like, "Yeah, that's torture," which it is. Obviously, waterboarding is torture. And holy shit! I don't know what just happened. Speaking of Andrew Wilson, Andrew Wilson is going to be on the Reverie tomorrow with me. So wow, what a quit. Is that deja? That's not deja vu. 1 second. I'm still getting over being sick. Give me 1 second. I'm not gonna blow my nose on cam for you guys, but yeah, he said that this afternoon. Okay, holy shit. Wow. All right. Well, Andrew, I was just talking about Andrew Wilson, and now he's gonna be on the fucking. That's why. Hold on? Is that why you said that, Roland? Is that what you said? Did you say like bring up Andrew because he was saying he was going to be on? Because holy shit. Can I leak the topics? I don't see why not. We normally announce the topics beforehand. First of all, Fairy Queen, I'm gonna read the Vanity Fair article for sure, because he's awesome. Crucible is going into debate season after Andrew's West Coast trip, so they're looking for debaters and topics. I thought of you. Well, I mean, tomorrow's my fucking chance to make a good impression, I guess. Maybe get invited to more debate panels. So. Also, no, I'm gonna. He's got a sense of humor. I'm definitely gonna like it. But just a couple things with the UI. So I got a boom arm for my mic now, and part of the reason why I got the boom arm is because it forces me to look up more as opposed to look down. So I'm talking into the mic, but I'm also more in line with the camera. Because my fucking monitor is so wide, there's nowhere else I can really put my camera unless I was to put it way to the side. So then it'd be like even with my eyes, like, but it'd be like way to the side. So, oh shit. And so my question is, what do you guys think? Camera way to the side, but level with my eyes, or this shit where like sometimes when I look down, you see the top of my head. I don't like that personally, but I don't know what you guys think. This is fine. Sick. They don't do panels, it's 1v1. Just let me know what kind of topics you like and I can put it on the suggestion channel. Okay, absolutely, dude. I'll send you some things that I like to debate about, and we'll go from there. I mean, it'd be cool to get on more. I mean, obviously, there's the time set aside for the Reverie every week. That's not changing. And then, first I like it that we can see the flags. Yep. No, I like it. I like it as well. We got the Betsy Ross American flag behind us, and the Swedish flag over here. What was I gonna say? Oh yeah, Reverie for sure. And then Wix, I'm always gonna be partial to as well because when he has good topics, it's always good. Sometimes he'll do drama stuff, which is fine. I mean, you have the right to do it. I don't like that stuff. And then, but Wilson, the Crucible, that's going to be like politically. I mean, most of that's going to be like political topics, right? I mean, if that's like political topics and shit, then I think we're good. I mean, it's either the top of your head or a chin fold when you look down. Take your pick. Fair, fair. I have a decent jawline though. I did just shave, so once I lose 30, 40 pounds, then I'll move the camera over to the side. Because right now I'm at like so I feel I'm not that. It's just true. So I could stand to lose weight. I think most people could, especially Americans, if we're being honest. I'm 210 right now, 6'2", 210. That's BMI a little bit higher than I should be. I think in order to get to like right in the middle of good BMI, I got to drop down to 170. That's my goal. My goal is 170, and then I'll be right in the mark of good BMI. And for my body, for some reason, whenever I lose weight, it's like always in the best places. Like I lose weight like right here, and so it helps with the fucking Chad like image, which I used to have more of, but not as much anymore. But that's also part of aging. I also wanted to get a great big old beard when I was out hunting because that's some mountain man shit. I love hunting. I got a deer. I don't know. I know we've mentioned it on here, but yeah, I got a 9-point, 150 something pound buck. It was a great time. And now I got a bunch of venison jerky that I've been eating, and it's good stuff. Have you tried eating once a day? That helped me lose over 80 pounds. I lost 42 pounds at the end of high school by eating only breakfast. Yeah. Eating once a day is honestly one of the best ways to lose weight, in my opinion. Now, I'm not a fucking dietitian, but this is just anecdotally. Now, is that healthy? I don't know. So if it's healthy, good. It's not anorexia if you're eating once a day. Isn't that just like intermittent fasting? Like you're still eating. Like I would eat a full breakfast to the point that I was stuffed, and then I just wouldn't eat until the next breakfast. That's what I did. And then I also worked out every day. And that alone, like that within only like 3 months, like 3 or 4 months, I dropped 42 pounds. Yeah, it was a lot of weight. And it showed so much. It was wild. I felt so much better. I had so much more energy. And I still have like more energy than I did then. It helped a lot with depression. I think depression, like people just don't really appreciate like how much the correlation there is between depression and weight. Not just in the fact of like, yeah, if you're depressed, you're going to eat more and get fatter, but also just like being able to move easier, being able to like look in the mirror and just like feel more comfortable, being able to like walk outside and be able to like not be out of breath, being able to, et cetera, being able to hike. Because, I also, by working out every day, like I also gained like weight and muscle. So that was like losing like 40 pounds with just fat, right? With the muscle gain on top of that. Man, I felt it was the end of high school. It felt great. I woke up every morning just feeling awesome. I jumped out of bed and it was, now I'm just like, my joints, just getting older, right? Still a little bit of, not as much energy as back then, but I feel like if I got down to 170, then I feel great. I feel a lot better. And that's ultimately, honestly, what weight loss should be about, which is being healthy and feeling good. Like not just like feeling good in terms of looking at yourself, but feeling good in terms of like you swing your legs over the bed and it's not hard, right? It's just that in of itself is such like a boon to be able to just swing over the bed and just jump up and like feel weightless almost, to just feel like you can move. the sense of freedom, the sense of liberty that imparts, in my experience, was liberating. It was awesome. So if it's unhealthy to eat once a day, then don't do it. But if the evidence demonstrates, I mean, just to be frank, that's what I did. And if you have some kind of condition, obviously, where you can't do that, don't do that, right? But I think it's fair to say most Americans, including myself, could probably get away with eating less and eating better, working out more, all that good shit, drinking less. Whatever works is my idea. Yeah, I agree. I cut sugar out of my diet like 3 months ago. I haven't, now cutting sugar out of my diet, I obviously still eat fruits and vegetables, but I cut out all soda and all candy and all cake and it's like junk food with sugar in it, basically. I still eat chips. I cut out all of that like years ago. And I don't eat well. I'm going to be honest with you. I eat a lot of frozen food, a lot of fatty food, a lot of chips. And I'm kind of just like hovering at the same weight because I don't drink soda and because I don't eat like cake and candy and stuff. Like ice cream and soda is so like heavy and it's so bad for you that like you can get away with eating pretty shitty as long as you don't eat as long as you don't drink soda. Just soda, I think honestly, this is a hot take, but I genuinely believe this. I think soda should be classified as a drug at this point. I'm not saying we should ban it, but I'm saying we should probably regulate minors using it. I know the more libertarian friends of mine, which I consider myself to be a libertarian as well, but I also don't want to sell 4-year-olds alcohol. I don't want to sell them Coca-Cola either, because I mean the obesity epidemic's a problem. Tooth rot and obesity is becoming a pandemic. Yeah, I agree. I do too. Frozen food is easy, especially if you work full time. That's my problem. 100%. That's my problem with it. Just like I'm working a lot, and when I'm working, I just I gotta eat now, and I don't want to make food. So then I just reheat food, usually frozen food. So many kids having full tooth extractions. What about diet soda? So my understanding is soda is like one of the worst things. At least, so dentists by and large hate, of course they love soda because it gives them more business. But they say they hate soda because it's like the worst for your teeth. Eat your deer once a day will do, absolutely. Sodas are dramatically overconsumed. They're incredibly bad for you. Diet soda, I am highly skeptical of diet soda. I don't think it might not be as bad for you as regular soda, but it's not good. It's really not good. And this is just like my experience, but there's some data that suggests this as well. So among diet ingredients, oftentimes what they'll use are stevia, erythritol, aspartame, and sucralose. Now, sucralose has been through studies and shows it has a propensity to lower gut bacteria, which is what I've experienced too. Whenever I used to eat things that are high in sucralose or have a lot of sucralose in them, I got constipated as shit, dude. It was awful. So I cut that out, and that helped. Erythritol, opposite problem. It destroyed me. It destroyed my guts. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but it was horrible. And there's some evidence just recently that indicates that, not causation, there is a correlation between erythritol and heart problems. So I cut that out of my diet. What was the other one? I listed 4, but I only just talked about 2. Stevia. I haven't had any issues with that. I don't know if that's a problem, but I haven't had any issues with that. It could be a problem. Generally like to avoid it, but I don't know if it's bad. Aspartame is one of the oldest used ones. I don't like it because it has a bitter aftertaste. You'll notice that with diet sodas, they have a bit of a bitter aftertaste. They've done because it's the oldest, they've done the most studies on it, and it appears to be mostly safe for human consumption, but it definitely helps the body retain fat. So drinking diet soda is not good for your health because it helps you retain fat. It prevents your body from naturally burning through the fat. Baking with stevia doesn't work, sadly. This is the number one problem when it comes to that I found when it comes to trying to cut down on sugar, is that sugar is actually an essential part of baking, just in the way that the ingredients work together to actually like create the cookies. So like if you try to bake with like sugar substitutes, you got to be careful. I know erythritol bakes pretty well, but again, erythritol is not that good for you. Stevia might not bake that well. Jen picked me up a diet vanilla Coke today. It was good, really good, but even diet soda I try to limit. Yep, try to limit it. It's not good. I mean, is it going to kill you? Is having one going to kill you? No. There's also a study that implied that aspartame metabolizes into formaldehyde in the human brain, but it wasn't in sufficient quantities to actually like be a danger. But that kind of scares the shit out of me. I don't know. Is it probably more like fear than rationality? Probably, but I mean, it's good to avoid anyway. It's always good. Why is erythritol not good for you? For me, it destroys my gut, and it does for a lot of people as well. That's a known side effect. Not for everybody, but for some people it does. And a recent study about, I think a year ago only, it came out that there was an association between erythritol consumption and heart failure or heart attacks, specifically myocardial infarctions. That doesn't mean it causes it. That could just mean the kind of people that like erythritol are also the kind of people to have more heart attacks, which I could see the pathway there, right? Somebody concerned about their weight probably is going to be more likely to be overweight. And they're probably going to be more likely to be eating, although I'm pretty sure the study did control for weight. I don't know. I just avoid it. I have to avoid it anyway because it destroys my gut. A mummified brain, ultimate brain freeze. Yeah, maybe if you mummify it enough, then you'll live longer. I don't know. I've heard that theory when it comes to rice, that because people like cultures that eat rice more have a longer lifespans. Part of that's because rice is high in arsenic, and arsenic is a preservative, right? People poisoned with arsenic, their bodies tend to not decay. This is like just based. I got no empirical evidence for this. This is just like an empirical exercise that I think of. It makes sense, but I doubt it. It probably has to do more with the fact that rice is a lower fat content than most other cultures as staple foods. And that eating rice is actually, people who eat rice as opposed to wheat or, in my state, beer probably is a staple food. People who eat rice instead of that are probably better off. Have you guys had sake, by the way? I don't know can I talk about alcohol on Twitch? Pretty sure. I mean, okay, if you're under 21, don't listen, but sake is awesome. What a sick fucking drink. Generally good to avoid. Yeah. It's good though. Rice cultures tend to eat a lot more fish. That's true as well. Sake, it's a Japanese rice wine. It is dangerous. Okay, it is incredibly dangerous, and I would recommend that if you ever have some, and you're over 21, obviously, because if you're under 21, you should not be drinking. Yada yada. But if you are 21 or older, try it in small quantities because it does not taste at all like alcohol. At all, especially when it's hot. I drink it when it's hot. I love it when it's hot, and it does not taste at all. And so you can go through a lot very quickly if you're not paying attention. And then you stand up to go use the bathroom, and you're like, "Wow, standing up was a lot easier before." So don't do that. Just always drink responsibly. I drink it hot. Yes, sake is one of the few alcoholic drinks that you drink hot. They call it there's sake canisters. I don't even know what they're called. They're like cups. They're like this weirdly shaped cups. You can look it up probably. And you fill them up with sake and then you microwave it. And you microwave it for just a minute, and then it's like bubbling, and it's you gotta it's super hot. It's so good. It's like when you gotta have coffee hot. You gotta have sake hot. Same thing. I like whiskey cold for sure, but sake hot. I have cut down tremendously on drinking, by the way. I only drink once a week, which is good. I haven't seen any weight loss from it, unfortunately, probably because I've replaced it with drinking a pot of coffee a day, which I add milk to. I know. There's a hot pot restaurant here that has all you can eat and drink option that includes beer and sake. I think I remember you telling me about this. All you can drink sake sounds incredibly dangerous. And it also sounds like they'd probably get sued. This place honestly sounds dangerous. I can only imagine the kind of people that are going to be attracted to an all you can eat option, all you can drink option. It's going to be alcoholics, just flat out, right? Because there's alcoholics out there that, they can drink the whole, they have so much tolerance built up that they can drink a whole bottle of whiskey and they're not even drunk. if you go to all you can eat sake place, you can go through a lot of sake, and that's expensive. I mean, surely they must cut you off at some point. Otherwise, they're going to lose money. It's kind of like that endless shrimp. Do you guys know the endless shrimp at Red Lobster? I did the math. I didn't do the math. I Googled it and found out what the math was. If you eat like it was like 72 shrimp. If you have 72 shrimp, Red Lobster begins to lose money. And so I made it a goal that I was going to eat more than 72 because I wanted to get my money's worth. So I ate 100, and half of them were jumbo because the jumbo came in this garlic sauce, or not a garlic. It came in some kind of like crunchy thing. It was some kind of sauce that was incredibly delicious. The non-jumbo came in the garlic sauce. That was really good. I ate 100 shrimp in one sitting. They just kept bringing me plates. And this was back when I was a lot lighter too. So I was just determined. I did almost throw up. I actually had to like undo my belt when I was leaving because it was just so bad. I couldn't walk. It was awesome. As I was saying, we should be eating less. Yeah. Anyway. So, I mean, we got quite a bit off topic from homeschooling, but I mean, I guess we had a whole debate on that. We don't have to go over too much more. I'll post all of the studies, all the information that I was looking at. It is a lot of mixed stuff. I'd like to see more information, but yeah, I thought the debate went overall well. I'm curious to see. Duke does this thing where the audience in Discord, obviously not in here, because I mean, I think you guys maybe I don't know. Maybe you guys will. I don't know. I like to think that the people who watch me are pretty like impartial or try to be impartial. I think so, but I'm just curious to know what the results are of like a vote to see who won, because normally Duke will do those in his thing. Let me see here. Listen, we'll be a fair share of pizza too. I love pizza as well, but it is high in gluten. I'll tell you that. Did Lab and Erudite get into it on a panel recently? I don't know. Did they? Erudite is a smart cookie. Lav is a funny person. I think Lav is. I'll just say that Lav is very lucky about not getting banned sometimes. That's for sure. Because holy shit. So I guess this is kind of like anti-drama, but I'll go ahead. I'll say it. So Erudite, not so Erudite. We haven't spoken in a while. I guess it just hasn't been that we've been on a debate panel together. But every time we go on a debate panel, maybe not every time, but like most of the time, and maybe she does this with everybody, but like I think she's aware that like it's been like especially when it gets heated or whatever. She basically says like she compliments, like she's like, hey, like good job, like I know it was heated or whatever, but I really appreciate like your insight, et cetera, et cetera. She's just like a really, really like sweet person, at least in my experience. She's just like very, very sweet person to, basically outside of debate mode, to like everybody. She's just super nice. So, yeah, and that the fact that my experience with her has been so good, the fact that I've seen her just be sweet to everybody, including myself, just whenever it's off debate, off camera, she's just super nice. Has kind of informed my position a lot when it comes to debate, like or drama involving her, where it's like, hey, she's saying that this happened, and this other person who's a dick off debate is saying this happened. Well, who should I believe? The person who's generally kind and conciliatory and concedes points and says, "Hey, good job, yeah, that makes sense," et cetera, or the person who's just like a complete dick and complete digs heels in the sand kind of person. And I don't think it should take too much to know about potentially who I'm talking about there. That's it. That's the extent of the drama on this channel. I might vaguely reference perhaps some asshole that was really mean to Erudite and is really mean to a lot of people, and then for some reason doesn't ever get any flack for it, or maybe runs away before any flack actually comes his way. But yeah, that's the extent of no more drama. Anyway, I think Lab doesn't always have her thoughts well thought out. She will start with a fair half point and then just go off the rails. I think she's hilarious. I think she's a troll, and I think she's like a funny troll too. So I give her a lot of credit. Like when she jumped on the masculine panel and basically just started ranting about how none of us were masculine enough and how we should turn in our man cards. That was awesome. And it was, I think, what the panel needed, actually. Just like a little bit of levity. I don't know how the all-women's panel turned out, but I think that if there was an all-women's panel, like Admiral Gibbs or like some kind of boisterous man, like coming on afterwards, like, listen, all of you fucking, you guys got to get back in the kitchen, or like, some kind of like, obviously jokingly sexist position. I think that's always hilarious. So now, is Lav always joking? I don't know, but I also don't really care. So well, I think I'm probably gonna raid on out soon. But I'm thinking we used to do more like video game streams, and I kind of want to do that a little bit more. Obviously, there needs to be some kind of like political element to it, right? So I think every single time I've done it, I've been like losing at StarCraft while talking shit about Biden or something. I think I'm probably going to do more of those soon. I think that's a lot of fun. Maybe get some rusty StarCraft skills out of the way. Or sorry, rusty StarCraft skills in the way. Get them better. Get the rust out. Get the rust out of the way. Have you played Sid Meier's Civ 5? I've played Civ 1. I grew up on Civ 1. Didn't play 2. I played 3 a lot. I played Civ 3 a lot. I played Civ 4. I played Civ 5. I think I played Civ 6. Once you play Civ 3, once you get really into Civ 3, none of the other ones are good. Maybe this is a hot take. I played Civ 5. I still have Civ 5. It's just genuinely not as good of a game, in my opinion, as Civ 3. There's not enough content to play. Like the replayability seems to be boring. You hit a certain point in your like the evolution of your civilization that just feels boring. You're at some point where like there's no more places to expand. You got your religion, like you're trying to convert places, and you're just sitting there, and it's just like boring. I don't know. That's just my opinion. It feels way more slow. Civilization 3 is, in my opinion, a much better game. Civ 1 is a great game. Civilization 1, the fucking little squares, that's an awesome game. I used to play that so much. Playing Blazing Chrome, a 2D side-scrolling bullet hell game. Yeah. Can I stream that Rittenhouse game on Twitch without getting in trouble? What's Acquitted? I have that game. I'll play that game in Discord servers, like stream it just for like the memes sometimes. But it's a genuinely fun game, and I think playing it on stream would be fun. But I don't know if Twitch would allow it because it's political, and Twitch tends to lean more left wing. Ever played Papers, Please? I've watched people play that game. I've never played it. It looks interesting. It looks just like a regular puzzle game, which is okay. I mean, if it's for people love it, and I'm sure it's good. I just don't. I don't know. Twitch may be worth respecting soon. Why? Did I miss news? New guidelines? What happened? Is there? Can I start saying slurs? Is that the rule now? Which is crack. Oh, what? So they're doing more cracking down? I can't even say slurs. What do you mean? Why is it worth respecting? I'm kidding. I think it's a good thing that we don't have, which was also just recently a Twitter take from Erudite. There probably is a problem with having nude or basically nude hot tub streamers for 13-year-olds. Probably pretty fucked, especially that they're giving their money away. They're donating money to people, bouncing their, it's not good. So if they're actually cracking down on that, that's reasonable. Unless they want to go like full on, like, I don't know, like kick on steroids where you can do anything. I mean, that'd be interesting. I don't think that streaming site would last too long before like the feds got involved. Yeah. All right. Well, who should we rate on out into? Got some good people. Got some good people here. We got Reservoir, who is a lefty, but he told me that I won a debate when he was doing a review of a debate one time, which makes me immediately partial to him because he told me I won, which is sick. So clearly, he can recognize, good arguments. Because I was not because I make good arguments, but because I was putting forward the pro-libertarian position, which always is good arguments by virtue of being libertarian. So we know that he's reachable to some extent. So he's kind of who I'm leaning on as game night. Okay. All right. Well, we're going to rate on out into Reservoir. For all of you in the chat, for all of you who stuck around, for all of you who are just getting here, thank you guys so much for jumping in. Really, really appreciate the time. Really appreciate the comments and hanging out for the debate. Really appreciate you guys chatting after the debate, the sort of decompression, the debriefing of after the debate. Really, really appreciate everything. And for those of you who haven't given me a follow, please consider so. That way you can see when I do more stuff like this again in the future. And for those of you who have given me a follow, thank you so much. For all of you who are subs or give bits, really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Obviously, no obligation. Mostly just happy to have you guys here. And tune in tomorrow for a fucking a reverie with Andrew Wilson. Marriage is going to be one of the topics, so I'm guessing that is part of why he's in it, and that's where the hot takes are going to be had. Yeah. Have a great evening. Thanks.